The sand-clogged internal gears of Staff Sergeant Elena Vance's like a rangefinder ground with a sound like a dying cicada at 03:42 on a Tuesday, a noise that only she heard in the absolute silence of the Mojave's high desert. She was leaning against the cold, sweat-slicked metal of a Humvee at Fort Irwin, California, watching a heat signature on the horizon that the official sensors said didn't exist. In 3 weeks, she would be standing in a different desert 5,000 miles away, holding the lives of 300 soldiers in the palm of her hand, while a man who outranked her by 4 tiers told her she didn't know how to read a map. But here, in the pre-dawn chill of the National Training Center, she was just a small silhouette in a large uniform, a tactical air control party specialist whom the brass treated as a necessary piece of equipment rather than a human being. Elena grew up in Athens, Georgia, the daughter of a man who repaired high-end Swiss watches and antique grandfather clocks. While other girls were playing with dolls or soccer balls, Elena was sitting at a workbench with a jeweler's loupe pressed to her eye, learning the language of the gear and the mainspring. Her father didn't talk much, but he taught her that every machine had a heartbeat, a rhythm that could be felt through the fingertips. If a watch was gaining 3 seconds a day, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a hidden friction. She carried that perspective into the United States Air Force. To Elena, a battlefield was just a massive, chaotic timepiece. The movement of an enemy platoon, the timing of a supply convoy, the atmospheric pressure affecting a laser-guided bomb, they were all gears, and she was the only one who could feel when they were grinding. She had joined the military not out of a sense of grand adventure, but because the world of civilian life felt too loud and uncoordinated. In the military, there was a manual for everything, or so they said. But as she stood in the dark at Fort Irwin, the cold wind whipping through the greasewood bushes, she knew the manuals were failing. The heat signature she was tracking through the Leica was too steady to be a ghost in the optics. It was a person, or perhaps a small team, moving with a specific rhythmic cadence that suggested high-level training. She marked the coordinates on her ruggedized tablet, the blue light of the screen casting a pale glow over her sharp, high cheekbones. She didn't report it over the radio yet. She knew what the response would be from the TOC. "Vance, you seeing ghosts again?" Colonel Marcus Thorne's voice had boomed over the net 2 hours earlier when she'd reported a similar anomaly. Thorne was a man made of granite and bad intentions, a career infantry officer who had spent the better part of 25 years kicking indoors. He viewed JTACs, Joint Terminal Attack Controllers like Elena, as a bureaucratic hurdle. In his mind, if he couldn't see it through the iron sights of an M4 or feel it under his boots, it wasn't a threat. To him, Elena was a tech support kid who spent too much time looking at screens and not enough time in the mud. He treated her with a patronizing, fatherly distance that was more exhausting than outright hostility. He called her Sergeant with a tone that suggested he was humoring a child playing dress-up. Elena didn't argue. She never argued. She simply adjusted her grip on the rangefinder and waited. Beside her, Specialist Deuce Miller, her radio operator, shifted his weight, his gear rattling softly. Miller was a 20-year-old from Ohio who looked like he belonged on a cereal box, but he was the only one in the unit who had learned to read Elena's silences. He watched her now, seeing the way her jaw was set, the way she hadn't blinked in nearly 2 minutes. "You got something, boss?" Miller whispered. The boss was unofficial, a title earned through 6 months of Elena keeping them out of the simulated kill zones that the OPFOR, the opposing force, liked to set up in the draws and canyons of the Mojave. 200 meters past the burnt-out Bradley, Elena said, her voice a low, steady hum. "Bearing 049er. They're using thermal blankets, but they're moving too fast. The friction is heating the edges. They're trying to flank the colonel's command post." Miller looked through his own night vision goggles. "I don't see a damn thing, Vance, just sand and shadows." "Wait for the exhale," she said. A moment later, a tiny plume of white appeared on the thermal, a breath caught in the cold desert air. It was gone in a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Elena keyed her radio. "Vanguard Main, this is Romeo 16. I have a 3-man recon element at grid Alpha Tango 980. They are moving to intercept the CP, requesting immediate indirect fire on those coordinates." There was a long pause. The static on the radio felt heavy, like a physical weight. Then Thorne's voice came back, thick with irritation. "Romeo 16, this is Vanguard 6. Sergeant, we've got the 11th ACR pushing our front line. My scouts report that sector is clear. Stop chasing shadows and focus on the CAS transition for the morning push. You're overthinking the map again, kid. Stick to the script. Elena didn't flinch. She watched the thermal signatures move closer to Thorne's position. She could almost feel the gears of the battle slipping, a tooth breaking on a drive wheel. 6 Romeo 16, I am tracking movement. If you don't engage, they'll have eyes on your TOC in 10 minutes. That's enough, Sergeant, Thorne snapped. Stay off this net unless you have a confirmed target or a bird in the air. Out. Miller looked at her, his face pale in the moonlight. He's gonna get captured, isn't he? The opfer is gonna zip-tie the colonel in his own tent. Elena didn't answer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver pocket watch, her father's last gift. She flipped the lid, watched the second-hand sweep with a smooth, silent motion. She wasn't angry. Anger was a friction she couldn't afford. She was simply measuring the cost of being ignored. 10 minutes later, the radio exploded with the sound of simulated gunfire and the frantic shouts of Thorne's security detail. The ghosts Elena had seen had breached the perimeter, killing the guards and destroying the command center. The exercise was called to a halt. When the sun came up, painting the Mojave in shades of bruised purple and harsh gold, the debrief was held in the shadow of a commo-netted command tent. Colonel Thorne stood in the center of the circle, his face the color of a raw steak. He looked at the gathered officers and NCOs, his eyes skipping over Elena as if she were a piece of the landscape. "We had a lapse in perimeter security," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "A failure of the scouts to identify a flanking maneuver. We will rectify this before we wheels up for the real thing. I don't want anyone relying on their gadgets. Use your eyes. Use your gut. That's how we win." Elena stood at the back, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't point out that her gadgets had seen the threat 10 minutes before it arrived. She knew that in Thorne's world, admitting a JTAC, and a female sergeant at that, was right meant admitting that his own intuition was flawed. And Thorne would rather die than admit he was outpaced by a girl with a radio. The deployment came 2 weeks later. They weren't going to a well-established base with a green zone and a Pizza Hut. They were being sent to observation post Vanguard, a jagged tooth of rock and HESCO barriers deep in the Al-Hamad Desert, a desolate stretch of land near the intersection of 3 borders. It was a place where the wind felt like a blowtorch and the dust tasted of ancient salt and copper. The mission was to provide overwatch for a strategic supply route that the brass in D.C. was obsessed with, though no one on the ground could say why. The transition from the Mojave to the real desert was seamless for Elena. The heat was different, more oppressive, but the rhythm was the same. She spent her first 48 hours on the ground at OP Vanguard mapping the negative space, the places where the enemy wouldn't be, so she could narrow down where they would. She walked the perimeter, her boots crunching on the sun-bleached gravel, smelling the unique cocktail of the FOB, diesel exhaust, burning trash, and the sharp, metallic tang of the weapon oil. FOB Vanguard was a cramped, miserable square of dirt. The soldiers lived in tents that vibrated in the constant wind. The heart of the base was the TOC, a reinforced shipping container packed with screens, radios, and a map table that Thorne sat over like a king in a bunker. He had brought his entire command staff from the 3rd Brigade, a tight-knit group of infantry officers who shared his mud and blood philosophy. Elena was the outlier, the only Air Force liaison on the base, assigned to coordinate the air shield that was supposedly protecting them. On the 3rd night, the air felt wrong. The temperature hadn't dropped as much as it should have, and the wind had died down to a suffocating stillness. Elena was in the JTAC alcove of the TOC, a small corner crammed with her gear. The PRC-117G radios, the laptops, the video downlink receivers. Miller was asleep on a cot nearby, his breathing heavy and rhythmic. Elena wasn't looking at the screens. She was listening to the base. The hum of the generators was steady, but there was a secondary vibration, a low-frequency thrum that she felt in the soles of her feet. It was the sound of heavy engines far away, muffled by the dunes. She checked the seismic sensors they had buried 2 miles out. Nothing. She checked the long-range thermal cameras, just the shimmering heat of the rocks cooling down, but the vibration continued. It was a gear slipping, a minute friction in the night. She walked over to the main map table. Thorne was there nursing a cup of black coffee that smelled like it had been brewed in a radiator. He didn't look up when she approached. "Colonel," Elena said. "Sergeant Vance," he replied, his voice flat. "It's 0200. Don't you have some satellites to go talk to?" "The seismic sensors are quiet, sir, but the ground is moving. There's a heavy vehicle signature coming from the north-northwest. It's not ours." Thorne finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot. He leaned back, the plastic chair creaking under his weight. "The north is a salt flat, Sergeant. It's impassable for anything larger than a goat. My intel says the local militia is tied up 50 miles east. You're hearing the generators." "It's not the generators, sir. The frequency is different. It's a multi-vehicle movement masked by the terrain. If they are using the old smuggling routes through the wadis, they could be within 5 miles of us." Thorne sighed, a sound of profound boredom. He looked at his major, a man named Henderson who had played linebacker for West Point and shared Thorne's disdain for technical interference. "Henderson, you hear any tanks out there?" Thorne asked. Henderson smirked. "Just the wind, sir, and maybe the sergeant's imagination. It's a long way from Georgia, isn't it, Vance? The desert plays tricks on people who aren't used to it." Elena felt the familiar heat of controlled rage rising in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She kept her voice as steady as the second hand on her father's watch. "I'm asking for a Reaper to be diverted from the southern sector to do a SAR sweep of the NNW corridor. It'll take 20 minutes. "Negative," Thorne said, turning back to his map. "That Reaper is covering a convoy of 10 tons coming up the main supply route. I'm not moving air assets based on a vibration you feel in your boots. Go get some sleep, kid. That's an order." Elena stood there for a long moment. She looked at the map, then at the colonel, then at the darkened screens of the TOC. She saw the disaster forming. It wasn't a guess. It was a calculation. If she was right, the base was about to be hit by a force they weren't prepared for. If she was wrong, she would be sent back to the States in disgrace for disobeying a direct order from a colonel. She turned and walked back to her alcove. She didn't go to sleep. She sat down at her terminal and began to work. She didn't use the official channels. She had friends in the Air Force, people she had gone through the grueling JTAC pipeline with, people who knew that when Elena Vance said something was moving, the earth was indeed moving. "Deuce, wake up," she whispered, kicking Miller's cot. Miller bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. "What, we under fire?" "Not yet. Get the 117G on the high-gain antenna. I need a secure line to the 74th Fighter Squadron at Bagram. Don't go through the talks relay. Use the sat link." Miller looked at her, his eyes wide. "That's a major violation of comms protocol, Vance, if Thorne finds out we're bypassing the chain of command." "If I don't do this, Thorne won't be around to file the paperwork," Elena said. "Do it, now." While Miller worked the radio, Elena pulled up the topographical data for the north-northwest corridor. She looked at the wadis, the dry riverbeds that carved through the desert like veins. On the maps, they looked shallow, but she had studied the geological surveys. Those wadis were deep enough to hide a T-72 tank if the crew knew what they were doing. And the salt flats weren't impassable, they were just unpredictable. If the enemy had waited for the dry season, the crust would be hard enough to support a motorized column. She began to build a strike package. She didn't have authorization. She didn't have a mission number. She had a gut feeling and a set of coordinates that she was refining with every passing second. She was the clockmaker's daughter, and she was timing the arrival of a storm. "I've got Viper on the line," Miller whispered. "They're a pair of A-10s on a combat air patrol. They're bored and looking for work." Elena took the headset. "Viper 1-1, this is Romeo 1-6. I have a priority target of opportunity. Non-standard tasking. How's your fuel?" "Romeo 1-6, this is Viper 1-1. We're fat on fuel and heavy on ordnance. What you got for us? We aren't seeing anything on the official tasking list for your sector." "That's because it's not on the list yet," Elena said. "I need a silent approach from the north. Stay low, masked by the ridgeline. I'm sending you a kill box. Do not, I repeat, do not squawk on the open net. This is a quiet one." "Copy that, Romeo. We like quiet. Moving to coordinates now." Elena watched the icons of the two A-10s creep across her screen. They were 20 minutes out. She looked over at the colonel. He was laughing at something Henderson had said, leaning over a box of MREs. The atmosphere in the TOC was relaxed, almost festive. They were safe in their bubble of ignorance. The vibration in the ground was getting stronger now. Elena didn't need the sensors. She could hear the clanking of treads, the roar of diesel engines. The enemy wasn't just coming, they were accelerating. They knew the base's blind spots. They knew Thorne hadn't placed any pickets on the salt flats. "Vance!" Thorne's voice barked across the room. "What did I say about being on the radio?" He was walking toward her, his face darkening. He had seen Miller adjusting the high-gain antenna. "I told you to stand down, Sergeant. Are you disobeying a direct order?" Elena stood up, the headset still around her neck. She looked Thorne dead in the eye. She was 5'6", and he loomed over her, a wall of muscle and metals, but she didn't blink. "Colonel, there is a motorized battalion 3 miles from our north perimeter. They'll be in visual range in 6 minutes. I have air support on station." "You have what?" Thorne's voice rose to a roar. "Who gave you the authority to call in air support? I am the commander of this FOB. I decide when we engage." "There wasn't time for committee, sir," Elena said, her voice chillingly calm. "You're done, Vance," Thorne spat. "Miller, shut that radio down. Sergeant, give me your weapon. You're under arrest. Henderson, get the MPs." The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic beating of Elena's heart, which she kept under a layer of absolute ice. Thorne reached out to grab her arm, his hand massive and calloused. At that exact moment, the first mortar round hit. The explosion was close enough to shake the shipping container, sending a shower of dust and paint chips down from the ceiling. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the red glow of the emergency power. The relaxed atmosphere of the TOC evaporated in a heartbeat, replaced by the raw, jagged edge of panic. "Incoming!" Someone screamed. Thorne was thrown against the map table. He scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of shock. "Where did that come from? Report." "North perimeter," a voice yelled over the radio. "We've got contact, heavy armor, they're coming out of the wadis." The radio net turned into a cacophony of screams and gunfire. The base's small mortar team was trying to respond, but they were firing blind into the dark. The enemy had the high ground, and they had the momentum. Through the open door of the TOC, Elena could see the flashes of tank fire, muzzle blasts that lit up the desert like strobe lights. Thorne grabbed a radio handset, his hands shaking. "All units, defensive posture Delta, focus fire on the north. Get the scouts on the line. Where are my scouts?" "Scouts are overrun, sir." The response came back, brittle with fear. "They're in the wire. They're in the damn wire." Thorne looked around the room, his eyes wild. For the first time in his career, the mud and blood wasn't working. He was being outplayed by a force he hadn't believed in, coming from a direction he had dismissed. He looked at Elena, who was already back at her terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. "Vance," he stammered. "Those planes, where are they?" Elena didn't look at him. She was looking at a thermal feed from Viper 11, which had just crested the ridge. The screen was a sea of white-hot signatures, dozens of trucks, 4 tanks, and hundreds of infantrymen swarming toward the FOB. "They are on the way, Colonel," Elena said, her voice a sharp blade in the chaos. "But you're going to have to get out of my way." Thorne opened his mouth to speak, but another explosion rocked the base, closer this time. The HESCO barriers at the north gate vanished in a cloud of fire and debris. The sound of small arms fire was now constant, the rhythmic asterisk thud-thud-thud asterisk of a heavy machine gun chewing through the tents. Elena keyed her mic. "Viper 11, this is Romeo 16. You are cleared hot. I say again, cleared hot. Target is the motorized column at the north gate. Danger close. I'm marking the friendly perimeter with an IR strobe now." "Copy, Romeo. We see your strobe. BR-RA-RA-RA-RA-RA-RA-T in 5 seconds." The sound of an A-10 Warthog's GAU-8 Avenger cannon is unlike anything else in the world. It's not a series of shots. It's a physical tear in the fabric of the universe, a long, guttural roar that sounds like a giant ripping a sheet of metal in half. Inside the TOC, the sound was deafening. The ground didn't just vibrate, it buckled. Outside, the desert erupted. The A-10s swept in low, their shadows dancing over the FOB, and the column of enemy armor began to disintegrate. The 30mm depleted uranium rounds shredded the T-72s as if they were made of tin foil. Secondary explosions from the enemy's ammunition trucks lit up the night, turning the Al-Hamad Desert into a vision of hell. Elena watched the screen, her eyes cold and precise. She wasn't cheering. She was calculating. She was watching the gears of the enemy's assault grind to a halt, one shattered vehicle at a time. Viper 11, good hits. Shift fire 500 meters north-northwest. They're trying to rally in the wadi. Copy, shifting fire. Thorne stood behind her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was watching the screen, watching the destruction she was orchestrating with a few calm words. He looked at her small, dirt-streaked hands on the keyboard, the same hands he had tried to take a weapon from 5 minutes ago. The battle raged for another 20 minutes, but the momentum had shifted. The enemy, caught in the open by the most fearsome ground attack aircraft in the American arsenal, had no choice but to break. Those who weren't incinerated fled back into the darkness, leaving behind a graveyard of burning metal. When the sun began to rise again, the desert was silent, except for the crackling of the fires and the occasional pop of a cooking-off round. The FOB was a mess, tents shredded, equipment destroyed, but the perimeter had held. Not a single American soldier had been killed. Elena stepped out of the TOC, the morning air tasting of smoke and ozone. She felt a profound exhaustion in her bones, the kind that no amount of sleep could fix. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's watch. She checked the time. 05:30. The movement had been stopped. The gears were still. She heard boots on the gravel behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the gate. Colonel Thorne stopped a few feet away. He looked out at the smoking ruins of the enemy battalion, then at the woman standing in the middle of his ruined base. He looked older than he had the day before. The granite had cracked. "Sergeant Vance," he said. His voice was low, stripped of its usual bravado. Elena turned. She stood at attention, her face a blank slate of military discipline. "Sir." Thorne opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to thank her, perhaps to bark another order. But the words didn't come. He looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see a kid or a tech support sergeant. He saw the person who had saved his life and the lives of every man on the base. He didn't say anything. He simply nodded, a short, sharp movement of his head, and walked past her toward the perimeter. Miller came out a moment later, clutching 2 cups of lukewarm coffee. He handed one to Elena. "So," he said, looking at the horizon, "I guess we're not getting court-martialed." Elena took a sip of the coffee. It was terrible, bitter, and full of grit. She loved it. "The day isn't over yet, Miller. There's a lot of paperwork to do. You think he'll give you a medal?" Elena looked at the silver watch in her hand. She thought about her father's workshop in Athens, the smell of oil and the sound of 1,000 clocks ticking in unison. She thought about the cost of being right and the weight of the silence that followed. "I don't want a medal, Deuce," she said, her voice soft. "I just want him to listen next time." But as she looked at the smoke rising from the salt flats, she knew the next time was already coming. She could feel it in the air, a new friction, a different gear slipping. The motorized battalion had been a test, a probe. Whoever had sent them wasn't done yet. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long, jagged shadows over the Alhamad, Elena Vance realized that the timepiece she was tracking wasn't just a battle. It was a war. She finished her coffee and handed the cup back to Miller. "Get the long-range comms back up," she said, her voice regaining its command. "I want a full atmospheric profile and the satellite schedules for the next 72 hours. And Miller?" "Yeah, boss. Tell the 74th to stay on high alert. We're going to need them again before the week is out." She walked back into the TOC, her silhouette small against the vast, unforgiving desert. She didn't look back at the colonel, and she didn't look at the wreckage. She looked only at the screens, searching for the next shadow, the next breath of white in the cold air, the next gear that was about to break. The briefing that afternoon was different. The map table was still there, but the atmosphere had shifted. Thorne sat at the head, but he didn't speak. He waited until Elena entered the room. The other officers, the men who had smirked at her imagination, now moved aside to let her pass. They didn't look her in the eye. Elena walked to the table and laid out her tablet. She didn't wait for permission. "The battalion we hit was a vanguard element of the 14th Republican Brigade," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. "They weren't here to take the base. They were here to fix us in place while a larger force moves toward the valley to the south. If we stay here, we're just a target. If we move, we can intercept them." Thorne looked at the map, then at Elena. He didn't ask Henderson for his opinion. He didn't talk about his gut. He looked at the data Elena had compiled, the patterns, the timing, the inescapable logic of the gears. "What do you need, Sergeant?" Thorne asked. "I need 3 Reapers, a dedicated satellite link, and the authority to move our perimeter 3 miles out," Elena said. "And I need you to trust me." Thorne leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. He looked at the woman who had seen the ghosts in the Mojave and the tanks in the Wadi. He saw the fire in her eyes, a controlled, precise flame that was hotter than any desert sun. "You have the Reapers," Thorne said, "and you have the authority. As for the trust—" He paused, his gaze lingering on the charred remains of his command post visible through the window. "I think you've earned that, kid." Elena didn't smile. She didn't feel the victory. She only felt the weight of the responsibility. She knew that the colonel's trust was a fragile thing, and that the desert was a place that broke even the strongest gears. But as she began to outline the next move, she felt the smooth, silent sweep of the second hand in her mind. She was the clockmaker's daughter, and she was going to make sure this war ran on time. The radio buzzed. It was a new signal, faint and distorted, coming from a frequency that shouldn't have been active. Elena froze, her hand hovering over the tablet. She listened to the cadence, a series of short, rhythmic bursts. It wasn't a militia. It wasn't the 14th Brigade. It was a code she had only heard once before, during a classified briefing at Fort Meade. A code used by a specific shadow unit that didn't officially exist. Elena looked at Thorne, but he hadn't noticed. He was already shouting orders to his officers. She looked at Miller, who was busy with the antenna. No one else had heard it. No one else knew the language of this particular gear. The signal repeated. It was a set of coordinates. Elena's heart skipped a beat as she translated the numbers in her head. The coordinates weren't for the valley. They weren't for the salt flats. They were for the exact spot where she was standing. The base wasn't the target. She was. Elena closed her eyes for a split second, the coldness in her chest expanding until it was all she could feel. The game had changed. The timepiece was more complex than she had imagined, and someone somewhere had just turned the key. "Vance," Thorne asked, noticing her stillness. "What is it?" Elena opened her eyes. She looked at the colonel, then at the map, then at the door. She knew what she had to do. She knew what it would cost. "Nothing, sir," she said, her voice a perfect lie. "Just the wind." But as she turned back to her terminal, her fingers were already tracing a new path on the map, a path that led away from the base, away from the army, and deep into the heart of the storm. She had saved the camp, but the desert wasn't done with her. And she wasn't done with the desert. The first sentence of the report she would never write was already forming in her mind. The orders that saved Observation Post Vanguard were a lie, but the fire that followed was the truth. She looked at Miller, who gave her a thumbs up from across the room. She felt a pang of something like grief, a friction in her heart that she couldn't account for. She was going to have to leave them. She was going to have to go where the clocks didn't tick. The radio buzzed again. The signal was stronger now. Tick, tick, tick. Elena Vance stood up, adjusted her uniform, and walked toward the door. The colonel didn't stop her. He didn't even look up. He thought the battle was over. Elena knew it was only the beginning of the end. The metal handle of the TOC door was still vibrating from the last secondary explosion out on the salt flats when Elena's hand closed around it. She stepped out into the pre-dawn soup of smoke and settling dust. The transition from the red-lit chaos of the shipping container to the vast, indifferent silence of the Al-Hamad desert hitting her like a physical blow. Her boots didn't just crunch on the gravel. They felt the resonance of the earth, a low-frequency hum that shouldn't have been there. The air tasted of magnesium and the sour, chemical sting of fire suppressant. She walked toward the northern perimeter, her pace measured, her back straight, while around her the soldiers of the 3rd Brigade began the frantic, adrenaline-fueled work of post-contact recovery. Men were shouting, hauling crates of ammunition, dragging shredded commo netting away from the HESCO barriers. To them, the silence was a relief. To Elena, it was a different kind of noise, the sound of a machine reset, the gears clicking into a new, more dangerous configuration. She stopped 10 yards from the perimeter wire and looked north. The horizon was a jagged line of flickering orange where the A-10s had done their work. The T-72s were hollowed-out husks now, their turrets blown off like the lids of discarded jars. It looked like a victory. It felt like a funeral. "Boss, wait up." She didn't need to turn to know it was Miller. She recognized the specific rhythm of his stride, the slight drag of his left heel, a habit he'd picked up after a jump school injury at Fort Benning that he refused to put on his medical record. He caught up to her, his chest heaving, the PRC 117G radio on his back looking heavier than it had an hour ago. He stood beside her, looking out at the wreckage, his face smeared with grease and the pale dust of the Mojave's cousin. "Colonel's looking for you," Miller said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's got that look, the one where he's trying to figure out if he should pin a medal on you or throw you in the brig for the rest of your natural life. Henderson is already whispering in his ear about unauthorized use of air assets and bypassing the chain. They're scared, Vance. They're scared because you were right and they were almost dead." Elena didn't look at him. She was watching the way the smoke from the burning tanks didn't rise straight up, but swirled in a tight, counterclockwise spiral. The wind was shifting. A storm was coming, but not a weather event. Let them be scared, Deuce. Fear is a calibration tool. It tells you exactly where the friction is. "What's with the look?" Miller asked, leaning in. He was the only one who could see past the mask. The fight's over. We held. The Vipers are heading back to Bagram. We won. We didn't win, Elena said, her voice a low, steady vibration. We just survived the distraction. Did you hear the frequency I was tracking, the one right before the mortar hit? Miller frowned, his young face tightening. The burst transmission, I thought that was just atmospheric interference, or maybe the militia's encryption failing. It wasn't failing, it was perfect, Elena said. She reached into her pocket, her fingers finding the cool, smooth surface of her father's silver watch. She didn't pull it out. She just held it, feeling the heartbeat of the internal springs. It was a Phase 9 handshake. I saw the protocol once at Hurlburt Field during a joint spec exercise. It's a high bandwidth, low probability of intercept burst. It's what our own Tier 1 units use when they don't want the regular army to know they are in the neighborhood. Miller's eyes widened. You're saying that wasn't a militia, that was us. Friendly fire. No, Elena said. It was a signal intended for this coordinate, but it wasn't for the 3rd Brigade. It was a beacon. They weren't trying to destroy the base, Miller. They were trying to flush something out, or someone. She felt the weight of the secret like a stone in her gut. She had spent her life learning to read the movement of parts, the way a tiny flaw in a hairspring could eventually stop a clock that stood 6 feet tall. This wasn't a battlefield error. It was a design. The 14th Brigade had been the hammer, meant to create enough noise and chaos that the Phase 9 signal would be lost in the static. But they hadn't accounted for a woman who listened to the world through a jeweler's loop. Vance! The voice was like a gunshot. She turned to see Major Henderson marching toward them, his face a mask of bureaucratic fury. Behind him, 2 MPs stood with their hands on their holsters, their expressions uncomfortable. Henderson was a man who lived for the hierarchy, a man who believed that the world was governed by the thickness of one's file and the shine on one's boots. To him, Elena Vance was a malfunction in his perfectly ordered universe. Sergeant Vance, you are to report to the TOC immediately, Henderson snapped. Colonel Thorne has received a priority flash from CENTCOM. There is an investigative team inbound from Riyadh. You are to surrender your encryption keys and your mobile devices to my office. Now. Elena didn't move. She felt Miller tensed beside her, his hand twitching toward the strap of his rifle. She put a hand on his arm, a brief, firm pressure that told him to stay still. On what grounds, Major? I am a TAC specialist under Air Force Command. My equipment and keys are property of the 74th Fighter Wing. Don't play lawyer with me, Sergeant, Henderson spat, stepping into her personal space. He smelled of cold coffee and the metallic tang of a man who had spent the battle hiding behind a map table. You bypassed the brigade commander's authority to launch a strike that has resulted in a massive diplomatic incident. The 14th Brigade was supposed to be a neutral deconfliction force according to the latest State Department cables. You just incinerated 40 vehicles belonging to a group we were trying to bring to the table. They were firing mortars into our wire, sir, Elena said, her voice remaining level, the ice in her tone making Henderson blink. Neutral forces don't generally employ T-72s in a flanking maneuver under the cover of a thermal masking blanket. That is for the Board of Inquiry to decide, Henderson said. As of this moment, you are being sidelined for administrative review. Hand them over. Elena looked past Henderson toward the TOC. She saw Thorne standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the red emergency lights. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a screen she couldn't see. He looked defeated, not by the enemy, but by the paperwork that was already beginning to pile up. The institution was failing, not through cowardice, but through the slow, grinding machinery of its own self-preservation. They would rather blame a sergeant for a diplomatic incident than admit the intelligence they were relying on was a lie. She reached into her vest and pulled out her ruggedized tablet and the small, black USB drive that contained her local encryption keys. She handed them to Henderson. The Major snatched them away as if they were trophies of war. You're confined to your quarters until the investigators arrive, Henderson said. Specialist Miller, you're on detail cleaning the motor pool. I want you two separated. Sir, Vance didn't do anything that... Miller started, his voice rising in heat. That's an order, Specialist. Henderson barked. Elena caught Miller's eye. She saw the flash of loyalty there, the same loyalty that had kept them together through a 100-mile ruck in the Georgia heat and a dozen close calls in the Al-Hamad. Miller wasn't just her RTO, he was the only person who saw the gears. If they separated them, she was blind and he was a target. Go, Miller, she said softly. The motor pool needs the help. She watched him go, his shoulders slumped, his boots dragging in the sand. She knew what he was thinking. He was thinking that the system was finally crushing her. But Elena was already calculating the time. The investigators from Riyadh were coming by chopper. That meant a 90-minute flight. Henderson would spend the next hour trying to find a way to frame the after-action report to protect Thorne's career. That gave her an hour. She was marched to her tent by the two MPs. They were young kids, barely out of AIT, who looked like they wanted to apologize. They didn't lock her in, there were no locks on a canvas flap, but they stood outside, their shadows long and thin against the tent wall. Elena sat on her cot. The tent smelled of dust and the faint, sweet scent of her own peppermint lip balm. She didn't panic. Panic was a friction. She sat in the dark and reconstructed the signal she had heard. Asterisk 049er, 049er, Alpha Tango 980. Asterisk the coordinates were for the base, but the timing of the burst was linked to a specific lunar window. It was a handshake intended for a ground-based receiver that was supposed to be active at that exact second. She hadn't just intercepted a message, she had stepped into a prearranged appointment. And then she saw it. The one gear that didn't fit. If the 14th Brigade was a neutral force, as Henderson claimed, why were they moving with thermal blankets? Why were they using smuggling routes known only to the elite units of the old regime? The answer was simple. The State Department cables were a fabrication. Someone inside the system was feeding the brigade command false intel to keep them from reacting, while at the same time, a shadow unit was using the 14th as a blunt instrument to clear the way for something else. She stood up and walked to the back of the tent. She felt the heavy canvas. With a small, sharp blade she kept hidden in the seam of her belt, she made a silent 6-inch incision near the ground. She peered through it. The MPs were still at the front, talking in low voices about a girl back in San Antonio. She slipped through the slit in the tent and into the negative space of the base. OP Vanguard was a maze of shadows and shipping containers. Elena moved with the silence of a shadow, her body tuned to the rhythms of the camp. She knew the patrol routes, the shift changes, the blind spots of the thermal cameras. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a component of the base itself. She made her way toward the motor pool, staying low against the HESCO. She found Miller behind a stack of rusted oil drums. He wasn't cleaning. He was sitting on his haunches, staring at the radio he hadn't surrendered. "I knew you'd come," he whispered as she slid into the darkness beside him. "You kept the 117G, Elena said. "Henderson forgot I had the secondary in the ruck," Miller said, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "He was too busy feeling important. What's the move, boss? We're officially radioactive. If we get caught out here, it's Leavenworth." "The move is to find out who sent that signal," Elena said. "It came from a mobile relay less than 5 miles north, right in the middle of the wadis. The A-10s missed it because it was masked by the wreckage of the tanks." "You want to go back out there?" Miller asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Beyond the wire, without an escort? Vance, that's suicide. The 14th Brigade might be broken, but there are still survivors out there. And if you're right about this shadow unit—" "I don't have a choice, Miller," Elena said. She looked at him, her eyes dark and hollow in the moonlight. "The system is failing. Thorne is paralyzed. Henderson is a vulture. If I don't find out what's in those wadis, the next signal won't be a handshake. It'll be a kill switch for all of us." Miller looked at her for a long time. He saw the woman who had guided him through the worst nights of his life, the woman who never guessed, who only knew. He saw the cost of her competence, the isolation, the weight of being the only one who could see the clock ticking. "I've got 3 spare batteries and a pouch of MREs, Miller said, standing up. "And I know where the keys to the LMTV are." "No vehicles," Elena said. "The engine noise will trigger the seismic sensors. We go on foot, through the north gate. There's a gap in the HESCO where the mortar hit. The guards are focused on the main road." They moved through the ruins of the north perimeter, sliding through the gap in the shattered barriers. The desert was cold now, the heat of the day sucked into the vacuum of the night sky. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made every breath feel like a shout. They moved across the salt flats, Elena leading the way, her mind mapping the terrain with the precision of a laser. As they walked, she felt the shift in the gears again. It wasn't a sound. It was a change in the atmospheric pressure, a subtle tightening of the air. She stopped and pulled Miller down into a shallow depression in the sand. "What is it?" he breathed. "Listen," she said. In the distance, beyond the smoking husks of the tanks, she heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't a helicopter. It was too fast, too light. "Drones," Miller whispered. "Ours?" No, Elena said. Ours have a different acoustic profile. These are commercial grade, modified for surveillance. They're eyes in the sky for someone on the ground. They waited as the drones passed overhead, their small red lights blinking like malevolent stars. Elena watched their flight path. They were circling a specific point in the wadi, about 3 miles out. The exact spot where she had calculated the signal had originated. "We have to get closer," she said. They moved through the darkness, the sand whispering under their boots. The cost of the journey was already mounting, the physical strain of the movement, the mental exhaustion of the constant vigilance, the knowledge that they were now officially AWOL. Elena felt the friction in her own heart, the fear of what they would find, but she pushed it down. She was the clockmaker's daughter. She didn't have the luxury of fear. They reached the edge of the wadi an hour later. The dry riverbed was a jagged scar in the earth, its walls steep and crumbling. Elena crawled to the edge and looked down. The wadi wasn't empty. Tucked under a natural overhang of rock was a small, high-tech encampment. It wasn't the tents and campfires of a militia. It was a cluster of sleek black pods, silent and glowing with a faint blue light. There were 3 men moving among the pods. They weren't in uniform. They wore gray tactical gear, no patches, no insignia. They moved with a fluidity that suggested years of high-level training. In the center of the camp was a large, dish-shaped antenna pointed straight up at the sky. "What the hell is that?" Miller whispered, his face inches from hers. "It's a satellite uplink," Elena said. "A dedicated pipe. They're bypassing the entire military satellite network. They're using a private constellation." She saw one of the men walk to a laptop and begin typing. Even from 100 yards away, she could hear the faint, rapid clicking of the keys. It was the same rhythm as the signal she had heard in the TOC. "They're the ones who sent the message," Miller said. "But who are they? CIA? Blackwater?" "They're not government," Elena said, her voice a chill in the night. "Look at the equipment. See the logo on the side of the pods. The stylized gear?" Miller squinted. "I can't make it out." "It's the logo for Kronos Global," Elena said. "They're a private defense contractor. They handle the logistics for the shadow missions the Pentagon doesn't want on the books. They are the ones who built the mapping software Thorn uses. They are the ones who wrote the deconfliction protocols for the 14th Brigade." "So, they're on our side?" "No," Elena said. "They are on the side of the clock. They don't care who wins or loses as long as the war stays on schedule. The 14th Brigade was supposed to destroy OP Vanguard to clear the way for a Kronos-managed supply route. When I called in the A-10s, I broke their schedule. I threw a wrench in the gears." She felt a surge of dark competence. She wasn't just tracking a battle anymore. She was tracking a conspiracy. Kronos Global wasn't just a contractor. They were the ones controlling the flow of the entire conflict. They were the ones who had fed the false intel to Thorn. They were the ones who had tried to silence her. "We have to get back," Miller said. "We have to tell the colonel if he knows it was a setup." "He won't believe us," Elena said. "Thorn is part of the system. He can't conceive of a world where the people who build his maps are the ones leading him into an ambush. And Henderson probably has a job waiting for him at Kronos when he retires. We're on our own, Miller." Suddenly, the man at the laptop stopped typing. He looked up, his head tilting like a predator catching a scent. He reached for a radio on his belt. "We've been spotted," Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Move now." They scrambled back from the edge of the wadi just as a burst of suppressed gunfire chewed into the sand where they had been lying. The sound was like a series of soft coughs, terrifying in their efficiency. "Go, go, go," Miller yelled. They ran across the salt flats, the darkness their only cover. Behind them, they heard the roar of an engine, a high-powered, low-noise vehicle, something designed for the desert. The hunters were coming. Elena didn't look back. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, the rhythm of her boots. She was calculating the distance to the base, the speed of the pursuit, the angle of the moon. She was the clockmaker's daughter, and she was running out of time. They reached a cluster of rocks about a mile from the base. Elena pulled Miller into a narrow crevice. "Wait," she said. "They're right behind us," Miller gasped. "I know, that's the point." She reached into her bag and pulled out the 117G radio. She hadn't used it yet, fearing the signal would be traced. But now she needed a distraction. She keyed the mic, not to the base, but to the emergency frequency used by the A-10s. "Viper 1-1, this is Romeo 1-6. Emergency tasking. I have a hostile element closing on my position. Coordinates Alpha Tango 972, requesting immediate suppression." There was a moment of silence. Then a voice came back. It wasn't the pilot she knew. It was a cold, unfamiliar voice. Romeo 16, be advised. All air assets in your sector have been grounded for administrative review. We cannot assist. Please return to your base and report to your commanding officer. Elena felt the ice in her chest turn to lead. The system hadn't just failed, it had been weaponized against her. Chronos had already reached into the Air Force's command structure. They had locked down the sky. "They've got everything, Miller," she whispered. "The maps, the air, the radios, they've turned the entire theater into their own private timepiece." The sound of the vehicle was closer now. She could see the headlights, two narrow blue slits cutting through the dark. The men from the Wadi were closing in. They didn't have sirens, they didn't have a loudspeaker. They were coming to finish what the 14th Brigade had started. "What do we do?" Miller asked. He looked at her, his eyes full of a terrifying, desperate trust. "Boss, tell me what the gears are saying." Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver watch. She flipped the lid. The second hand was moving with its perfect, relentless sweep. She looked at the watch, then at the blue headlights, then at the distant lights of OP Vanguard. She saw the solution. It was a desperate move, a move that would cost her everything, her career, her freedom, perhaps her life. But it was the only way to break the cycle. "Give me the radio, Miller," she said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to send a message that even Chronos can't stop." She took the radio and began to reprogram the frequency. She didn't use the military bands. She went to the open, international distress frequency used by every ship, every plane, and every civilian radio operator in the Middle East. It was a signal that couldn't be encrypted, couldn't be hidden, and couldn't be ignored by the global community. "This is Staff Sergeant Elena Vance, United States Air Force," she said, her voice projecting a calm, terrifying authority. "I am reporting a breach of international deconfliction protocols by Chronos Global. I have evidence of a coordinated attack on U.S. forces at Observation Post Vanguard. If you are hearing this, the system is compromised. I say again, the system is compromised." She repeated the message over and over, her voice a steady drumbeat in the night. She knew that back in the TOC, Thorne and Henderson were hearing it. She knew that in Riyadh, the investigators were hearing it. And she knew that the men in the blue-lit vehicle were hearing it. The vehicle stopped 50 yards away. The doors opened. 3 men stepped out, their weapons raised. "Vance, stop!" One of them yelled, "You're making a mistake. We're here to help you." "The friction is too high for lies," Elena said, her voice carrying over the sand. She turned to Miller. "When I start running, you go the other way. Get to the base. Find the MPs. Tell them what you saw. They're too young to be bought yet. They'll listen." "I'm not leaving you, Vance," Miller said. "That's an order, specialist," she said, and for the first time her voice broke. It wasn't fear. It was the sound of a heart finally admitting the cost of the mission. "Go, now." She stood up and ran, not away from the men but parallel to them, drawing their fire. The suppressed rounds hissed past her like angry insects. She felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, a hot, searing flash that made her stumble, but she didn't stop. She kept running, the radio still in her hand, the message still broadcasting to the world. She saw Miller disappear into the shadows, heading for the base. She felt a brief, flickering moment of hope. If he made it, the truth would be out. The gears would grind to a halt. She reached a high ridge and stopped. She was out of breath, her shoulder a mass of fire, her vision beginning to blur. She looked down at the men. They were closing in, their movements methodical and cold. They were the perfect soldiers for a perfect machine. Elena Vance reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver watch. She looked at it one last time. The glass was cracked, the internal springs visible through the fracture. It was still ticking. "Time's up," she whispered. She didn't surrender. She didn't beg. She simply stood on the ridge, a small, bloody silhouette against the rising sun, and waited for the end of the world she had tried so hard to keep in balance. The first rays of the sun hit the desert, turning the Al-Hamad into a sea of gold and blood. In the distance, she heard the sound of more helicopters, not the investigators from Riyadh, but something heavier, something more powerful. The real military was finally waking up, alerted by the signal she had sent. The sky was filling with the sound of rotors. The men in the gray gear stopped. They looked up at the sky, their faces unreadable. They knew the game was over. They began to retreat, moving back toward their vehicle. Elena fell to her knees. She felt the cold sand against her palms. She was alive. She had won. But as she looked at the helicopters circling overhead, she knew the victory was hollow. She had broken the system to save it, and the system would never forgive her for that. She saw a group of soldiers running toward her from the base, led by a figure she recognized as Miller. He was shouting her name, his face a mask of joy and terror. Elena closed her eyes. She felt the rhythm of the earth, the rhythm of the helicopters, the rhythm of her own failing heart. She was the clockmaker's daughter, and she had finally found the friction she couldn't fix. The last thing she heard before she lost consciousness was the sound of her father's watch, its tiny, persistent tick echoing in the vast, empty silence of the desert. Asterisk tick, tick, tick. Asterisk she didn't know if she would ever wake up. She didn't know if Thorne would ever look her in the eye again. She didn't know if Kronos Global would find another way to start the war. But as the darkness took her, Elena Vance knew one thing for certain. The machine had stopped, and she was the one who had turned the key. The sound of the helicopters grew deafening, the downdraft whipping the sand into a frenzy around her body. The world was a blur of noise and light, a chaotic, uncoordinated mess that she no longer had the strength to organize. She felt hands on her shoulders, strong, familiar hands. "I've got you, Vance," Miller's voice said, sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. "I've got you. The medics are right here. Just hold on." Elena wanted to tell him that she was holding on. She wanted to tell him that the gears were safe. But the words wouldn't come. She could only feel the cold, silver watch in her hand, its broken heart still beating against her palm. And then the silence finally came. The debriefing room at the Riyadh embassy was a sterile, windowless box that smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and the dry, recycled air of a high-end bunker. Elena sat at the center of the long, mahogany table, her arm in a white sling, her face pale but composed. Across from her sat 3 men in dark suits, representatives from the State Department, the DIA, and a man whose name she hadn't been told but whose silence carried the weight of the entire intelligence community. "Sergeant Vance," the unnamed man said, his voice as smooth as a polished stone. "We have reviewed your unauthorized broadcast. We have also recovered the equipment from the Wadi. It seems you were correct about the presence of Kronos Global assets in the Al-Hamad." Elena didn't blink. She looked at him with the same patient, unflinching gaze she had used on the heat signatures in the Mojave. "And the 14th Brigade. A tragic misunderstanding," the man said, dismissing the deaths of hundreds of men with a slight wave of his hand. "Kronos has been relieved of their contracts in that sector. Colonel Thorne has been reassigned to a training command in Fort Moore. Major Henderson has opted for early retirement." "And me?" Elena asked. The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You, Sergeant, are a problem. You saved an American base, but you did so by exposing a level of operational complexity that was never meant for the public record. You broke the chain of command. You bypassed the very systems that are designed to keep this country safe." "The systems were failing," Elena said. "I didn't break them, I just showed you where the friction was." "The friction is what keeps the machine from spinning out of control, Sergeant," the man said. "Without it, we have chaos. We have people like you making decisions that affect the global balance of power." He pushed a folder across the table. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a non-disclosure agreement with a set of terms that would effectively erase the last 48 hours of her life. "Sign this, and you will receive a commendation for your actions during the initial defense of OP Vanguard," the man said. "You will be promoted to technical sergeant and given a choice of any assignment in the Air Force. You can go back to Athens. You can teach at the academy. You can disappear into the system. And if I don't sign?" The man smiled, a thin, mirthless line. "Then we move to a court-martial, disobeying a direct order, unauthorized broadcast of classified information, theft of government property. You will spend the next 20 years in a cell at Leavenworth, and the world will never know your name." Elena looked at the paper. She thought about Miller, who was already being processed for a new assignment in Okinawa. She thought about her father's workshop, the quiet, steady ticking of the clocks. She thought about the cost of being right in a world that rewarded the lie. She picked up the pen, but she didn't sign the paper. She turned it over and wrote a single sentence on the back in a sharp, clear hand. Asterisk, the clock is still ticking. Asterisk, she pushed the paper back to the man. "I don't want a promotion, and I don't want a cell. I want you to look at the seismic data from the southern corridor, the data Kronos tried to delete." The man's expression didn't change, but she saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the friction. "What are you talking about?" "The 14th Brigade wasn't the distraction," Elena said, her voice a sharp, precise blade. "The Kronos team in the Wadi wasn't the distraction. They were the noise. While you've been sitting here trying to figure out how to silence me, the real movement has already begun. There is a motorized division moving under the salt crust of the empty quarter. They're using the same thermal blankets, the same burst transmissions, and they're not heading for a base. They're heading for the oil fields." The room went silent. The man in the suit looked at the folder, then at Elena. He saw the woman who had seen the ghosts, the woman who had timed the storm. He saw that she wasn't guessing, she was calculating. "How do you know this?" he whispered. "Because I took the dish from the wadi before Miller reached me," Elena said. She reached into her sling and pulled out a small, blood-stained memory card. She laid it on the table. "I have the logs, I have the schedule, and I have the coordinates for the next handshake." She stood up, her small frame dominating the room. She looked at the three men, the architects of the system that had tried to crush her. "The machine is broken," Elena Vance said, her voice echoing in the sterile room like a bell. "And I'm the only one who knows how to fix it. So here is the new arrangement. You give me a team, you give me the sky, and you let me do my job, or you can let the oil fields burn and explain to the president why the clockmaker's daughter was right again." The man in the suit looked at the memory card, then at the woman standing before him. He saw the fire in her eyes, the dark competence that had survived everything they had thrown at her. He saw that the world was indeed a massive, chaotic timepiece, and that he was looking at the only person who could feel when the gears were grinding. He picked up the memory card. "Welcome to the shadow, Sergeant Vance," he said. Elena didn't smile. She didn't feel the victory. She only felt the weight of the next mission. She turned and walked out of the room, her silhouette small against the vast, unforgiving machinery of the embassy. She didn't look back. She looked only ahead, toward the desert, toward the storm, toward the next gear that was about to break. Outside, the sun was setting over Riyadh, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and harsh gold. Elena Vance reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's watch. She checked the time. 18:00. The second hand moved with its perfect, relentless sweep. Asterisk tick, tick, tick. Asterisk. She closed the lid and stepped into the waiting car. The war was just beginning, and she was the one who was going to make sure it ran on time. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the heavy traffic of the city. Elena sat in the back, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She felt the vibration of the engine, the rhythm of the road, the subtle friction of the world around her. She was the clockmaker's daughter, and she was ready for the next hour. But as the city lights began to flicker on, she saw a car following them, a sleek black sedan with two narrow blue slits for headlights. Elena Vance didn't flinch. She simply leaned back against the seat and watched the car in the rearview mirror. She knew who they were, she knew what they wanted, and she knew exactly how much time they had left. The signal on her hidden receiver chirped once. A new coordinate, a new heartbeat, asterisk Alpha Tango 001. Asterisk, the first gear had just slipped. Elena Vance reached into her bag and pulled out a fresh radio. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't ask for permission. She simply keyed the mic and began to speak, her voice a sharp, steady hum in the gathering dark. "This is Romeo 16. I have a visual on the target. Let's get to work." The first bullet shattered the rearview mirror of the armored Chevrolet Suburban exactly 4 seconds after Elena Vance noticed the blue-tinted LED flicker in the reflection. A precise, high-velocity greeting that arrived before the sound of the suppressed muzzle blast could even reach the glass. The driver, a man named Kessler who smelled of expensive cologne and the sweat of someone who had spent too much time behind a desk at the embassy, let out a sound that was less a scream and more a sharp, wet intake of breath. He jerked the wheel to the right, the heavy B6-rated armor of the SUV groaning as the tires fought for purchase on the slick, sun-baked asphalt of the King Fahd Road. Elena didn't move her head. She didn't flinch. She felt the vibration of the impact through the frame of the seat, a low-frequency thud that she cataloged instantly as a 7.62 mm round, likely from a semi-automatic platform with a high-end optic. She didn't need to see the shooter to know they were at an elevated position, approximately 200 meters back, lead angle calculated for a vehicle traveling at 65 miles per hour. "Keep your eyes on the horizon, Kessler," Elena said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the sudden storm of glass and adrenaline. She reached out and placed her hand on the center console, her fingers feeling the heat radiating from the transmission tunnel. "The next one is coming for the front left tire. They're not trying to kill us yet. They're trying to channel us. They're embassy security. They're supposed to be." Kessler's voice cracked, his knuckles white on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. "They're not embassy," Elena interrupted, her tone devoid of judgment but heavy with the weight of a truth he wasn't ready to hear. "They're chronos. They've been pacing us since the consulate gate. They timed the light at the intersection of Alea Street to ensure we were separated from the trail car. You didn't notice the friction because you weren't looking for the gears. Now, drive." The Suburban roared as Kessler floored it, the heavy engine straining against the weight of the steel plating. Behind them, the black sedan with the blue-slit headlights drifted across 3 lanes of traffic with a terrifying, liquid grace. It didn't weave, it flowed, moving through the gaps in the evening commute like a predator through tall grass. Elena watched it through the cracked side mirror. She wasn't seeing a car. She was seeing a series of intervals, the distance between the sedan and the surrounding civilian vehicles, the timing of the brake lights ahead, the rhythm of the city's pulse. She reached into her sling and pulled her right arm free. The movement sent a jagged bolt of fire through her shoulder, the wound from the salt flats protesting the sudden exertion. She felt the warm, sticky sensation of the stitches beginning to pull, the copper scent of fresh blood starting to bloom under her tactical shirt. She ignored it. Pain was just another data point, a signal that required calibration. She reached into the footwell and pulled up the heavy black Pelican case she had insisted on bringing from the embassy. "What are you doing?" Kessler gasped, his eyes darting to the rear view. "We have to call for backup. We have to call the RSO. The RSO is currently being told that our vehicle has suffered a mechanical failure and we are off-comm," Elena said, her fingers dancing across the latches of the case. She pulled out a modified PRC 117G radio, the same one Miller had smuggled out of the motor pool, and a ruggedized tablet. "The signals you're hearing on your Motorola are a loop. They've hijacked the local repeater. You're talking to a ghost, Kessler." She keyed the tablet, her eyes narrowing as the screen flooded with a waterfall of green and amber data. She wasn't looking at a map. She was looking at the electromagnetic spectrum of the city. Riyadh was a forest of signals, cell towers, satellite uplinks, emergency frequencies, private encrypted bands. To anyone else it was noise. To Elena it was a clock. And right now the clock was being tampered with. "There," she whispered. She saw the spike. A high-bandwidth, low-probability of intercept burst, identical to the Phase 9 handshake she had intercepted at OP Vanguard. It was coming from the black sedan. They weren't just chasing them, they were slaving the city's traffic control system to their own tactical network. "Kessler, in 300 yards, the light at the flyover is going to turn red," Elena said. "Don't slow down. When it hits red, the cross-traffic from the south will get a green. They're timing a semi-truck to T-bone us. It's a kinetic intercept. It'll look like a tragic accident in the middle of a pursuit." "You can't know that," Kessler shouted, his breath coming in ragged hitches. You're just a sergeant, you're a TAC, you don't know how this works in the city." "I know how the gears move, Kessler," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold, hard steel of the machine itself. "I saw the handshake, I see the interval. If you don't do exactly what I say, we die in approximately 28 seconds. Downshift." Now, Kessler hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake. He looked at the light ahead. It was green. The road was clear. The world looked normal. But then he looked at Elena. He saw the woman who had stood on a ridge in the Al-Hamad and called down the sky. He saw the woman who didn't guess. He slammed the gear selector into manual and dropped 2 gears. The Suburban's engine wailed in protest, the tachometer needle buried in the red. "Now, floor it," Elena commanded. The Suburban surged forward. As they reached the center of the intersection, the light snapped to red. No yellow, no transition, just a digital override. From the right, a massive fuel tanker, already moving at 40 miles per hour, roared into the intersection. Kessler screamed, the wall of chrome and steel filling his side window. But the Suburban was already through the gap, the tail end of the vehicle clearing the tanker's bumper by less than 6 inches. The sound of the tanker's air horns was a deafening, mournful blast that faded as they shot onto the flyover. Behind them, the black sedan didn't even brake. It swerved around the tanker with a precision that was physically impossible for a human driver. "Drones," Elena muttered, her fingers flying across the tablet. "The car is slave to an AI pilot. They're running a pursuit algorithm. It doesn't have a reaction time, it just has a solution." She felt the cost of the maneuver in her shoulder, a hot, throbbing pulse that made her vision swim for a fraction of a second. She squeezed her eyes shut, visualizing the internal springs of her father's watch, the way the balance wheel swung back and forth, indifferent to the chaos outside. She forced her heart rate down. She forced her breathing to match the tick of the clock. "We can't outrun a computer, Elena," Kessler said, his voice trembling. He was using her name now. The hierarchy had evaporated in the heat of the intersection. "We're not going to outrun it," Elena said. "We're going to desynchronize it." She reached into the case and pulled out a small, hand-soldered device, a mesh of copper wiring and silver capacitors that looked like something salvaged from a 1970s television. It was the wrench she had built during the long, sleepless nights in the Mojave, a localized electromagnetic pulse generator designed to disrupt the specific frequencies of the Phase 9 handshake. It was illegal, highly dangerous, and the only thing that could stop a Chronos-grade AI. "I need you to take the exit for the Albatha district," Elena said. "The old city. The streets are narrow. The signal reflection will be higher. I need the friction. That's a maze. We'll get trapped." "Exactly," Elena said. "The computer likes open roads. It likes predictable vectors. It doesn't like a maze where every turn is a variable it hasn't mapped yet. Turn, now." Kessler yanked the wheel, sending the Suburban skidding onto the off-ramp. The heavy vehicle leaned precariously, the suspension screaming as it absorbed the lateral G-forces. They plummeted into the heart of the old city, the sleek glass towers of the financial district replaced by the sand-colored concrete and tangled power lines of the market district. The smell of the city changed: exhaust, roasting lamb, and the dry, ancient dust that seemed to coat everything in Riyadh. The sedan was still there, a black ghost in the rearview. It was closer now. Elena could see the driver. He wasn't even looking at the road. He was looking at a screen, his hands resting lightly on his lap. He was just a passenger in a killing machine. "In the next turn, pull the handbrake," Elena said. "What? I'll flip us." "The B6 armoring lowers the center of gravity. You won't flip, you'll slide. I need a 90-degree angle of incidence for the pulse. Do it on my count. 5, 4, 3. She held the device in her left hand, her right arm still pinned against her chest, the blood now soaking through her shirt and staining the tan upholstery of the seat. She felt the weight of the moment, the specific, crushing pressure of a choice that couldn't be undone. If she missed the timing, they would crash into a concrete wall at 50 miles per hour. If she hit it, she would fry every circuit in the Suburban, including the ones keeping them alive. 2, 1, mark. Kessler pulled the brake. The Suburban's rear end kicked out, the tires shrieking as they lost their grip. The world spun. For a heartbeat, Elena was looking directly into the windshield of the black sedan. She saw the driver's eyes. They were cold, empty. The eyes of a man who believed the machine would never fail. Elena pressed the trigger on the device. There was no sound, only a sharp blue spark that jumped from the capacitors to her fingertips. Every light in the Suburban's dashboard went black. The engine died instantly. The steering rack locked, but the pulse didn't stop at the glass. It expanded in a tight, invisible sphere, hitting the sedan like a hammer. The black car's headlights flickered and died. The AI pilot, suddenly blind and disconnected from its tactical mother lode, did exactly what a computer does when it encounters an undefined variable. It locked the brakes. The sedan pirouetted across the narrow street, slamming into a row of parked motorbikes before coming to a violent, shuddering halt against a stone archway. The Suburban came to a stop 20 yards further down, the silence that followed the crash so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Kessler was slumped over the wheel, his chest heaving, his face covered in a fine spray of glass from the shattered mirror. Elena sat perfectly still, her hand still holding the pulse generator. She could hear the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine, the distant sound of a prayer call beginning to echo from a nearby minaret, and the steady, wet drip of her own blood onto the floor mat. We did it," Kessler whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from 1,000 miles away. "You stopped it." Elena didn't answer. She was looking at the tablet. It was dead, the screen a cracked sheet of black glass. But she didn't need the tablet to know what was coming. She could feel the shift in the air. The friction was returning, but it wasn't the car. It was the city itself. "Get out," Elena said, her voice a rasping command. "What? No, we have to stay in the armor. It's the only—" "The armor is a tomb now, Kessler," Elena said, her movements slow and deliberate as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "The pulse told them exactly where we are. They have secondary interceptors. They'll be here in 3 minutes. We go on foot into the market." She forced herself out of the car. The Riyadh air hit her like a furnace, the dry heat of the evening sucking the moisture from her throat. Her shoulder was a solid mass of agony now, a screaming reminder of the cost of her competence. She took a step and nearly collapsed, her knees buckling under the weight of the tactical vest and the radio. She caught herself on the door frame, her fingers leaving a bloody smear on the white paint. Kessler scrambled out of the driver's side, looking around like a trapped animal. He was a man out of his element, a bureaucrat in a war zone. He looked at the wreckage of the sedan, then at Elena. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice small. "Into the gears," Elena said. They moved into the labyrinth of the Albatha Sauk. It was a riot of sensory input. The smell of cumin and coriander, the shouting of vendors, the rhythmic clanging of a metalworker's hammer. To Kessler, it was chaos. To Elena, it was cover. She moved with a rhythmic, measured stride, her body tuned to the flow of the crowd. She wasn't just walking, she was disappearing. They reached a narrow alleyway behind a spice shop. Elena stopped, her back against the cool, rough stone of the wall. She closed her eyes, listening. She heard the sound of a high-performance engine approaching from the north, another one from the south. The hunters were closing the perimeter. "Give me your phone," Elena said. Kessler handed it over without a word. She looked at the screen. No signal. They were jamming the entire block now. Kronos was willing to go dark in the middle of a foreign capital to find her. That meant the memory card in her pocket was worth more than she had imagined. It wasn't just a schedule, it was the blueprint for the entire regional collapse. "They're going to find us," Kessler whispered, his back against the opposite wall. "They have thermal, they have satellites, we can't hide in a spice shop forever." "I'm not hiding," Elena said. She looked at him, her eyes dark and hollow, the intensity in them making him take a step back. "I'm waiting for the transition." She reached into her vest and pulled out a small, silver object. It wasn't a weapon, it was her father's watch. She flipped the lid. The glass was still cracked, the internal springs still visible. It was the only thing in the city that wasn't connected to a network. It was the only thing that was purely, perfectly mechanical. She watched the second hand. Asterisk tick, 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 asterisk. In 60 seconds, the power grid for this district is going to reset. Elena said, "How could you possibly know that?" "Because the city of Riyadh uses a centralized cooling system for the old district. Every night at 19:00, the main pumps at the Al-Hair plant switch from primary to secondary. It creates a 3-second voltage sag across the entire eastern grid. Kronos' jammers are high draw. When the sag hits, their filters will lag for exactly 2 heartbeats. That's our window." Kessler stared at her. He didn't ask how she knew about the pumps. He didn't ask how she had calculated the lag. He just watched the watch. Asterisk tick, tick, tick. Asterisk. Elena felt the tension in her chest, the specific physical weight of a person who knows something true that no one else can see. She thought of Miller, probably sitting in a transit lounge at Kadena by now, thinking she was safe. She thought of her father, his hands steady as he adjusted the escapement of a grandfather clock. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, the isolation of the person who sees the gears while everyone else only sees the time. "Get ready," she whispered. The streetlights flickered. The hum of the city changed, a low-frequency groan that vibrated in Elena's teeth. The air seemed to thin. "Now!" She didn't run for the exit. She ran for a rusted metal door at the back of the alley, a service entrance for the district's underground utility tunnels. She slammed her shoulder against the door, the pain nearly blacking her out, but the latch gave way. She and Kessler tumbled into the darkness just as the lights on the street snapped back to full brightness. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and electrical ozone. It was a forest of pipes and cables, the arterial system of the city. Elena leaned against the door, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She could hear her own heart beating in her ears, a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm that she fought to master. "We're underground," Kessler said, his voice echoing in the darkness. "They can't see us here." "They can't see us yet," Elena corrected. She pulled a small flashlight from her vest and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a narrow walkway alongside a massive water main. "But they'll have sensors at the exits. We have to move toward the southern pumping station. It's 4 miles. We have to do it before the next shift change at the plant." They began to walk. The journey was a slow, agonizing crawl through the bowels of the city. Every step was a battle for Elena, her shoulder now a throbbing, sentient entity that demanded her entire focus to ignore. She felt the blood soaking into her waistband, the chill of blood loss beginning to creep into her hands. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. She simply placed one boot in front of the other, the rhythm of her movement a silent prayer to the god of the machine. Inside the crisis, there was a moment of pure, devastating clarity. They had reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3. Elena stopped to check the markings on the wall, her flashlight beam shaking slightly. Kessler was leaning against a pipe, his head in his hands. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly. Elena didn't look up. "Doing what?" "This, all of this. You could have signed the paper, you could have taken the promotion, you could be in Montana right now, drinking a beer and watching the sunset. Instead, you're bleeding out in a sewer in Riyadh because of a memory card." Elena stopped. She looked at the blood on her hand, the dark, slick texture of it in the flashlight's beam. She thought about the neutral force in the desert. She thought about the men in the gray gear who had tried to kill her. She thought about the way the machine didn't care about the truth, only about the schedule. "Because the gears are broken, Kessler," she said, her voice a low, steady vibration that seemed to fill the tunnel. "And if I don't fix them, nobody will. The people who sign the papers. They don't see the friction. They don't hear the clicking. They just look at the face of the clock and tell themselves that everything is fine. But it's not fine. The world is falling apart 1 second at a time, and I'm the only one who can feel it happening." She looked at him, and for the first time, Kessler saw the cost of her extraordinary capability. It wasn't a gift. It was a burden. She was a woman who could never stop listening to the world breaking. "I'm sorry," Kessler whispered. "Don't be sorry," Elena said, turning back to the tunnel. "Just keep walking. We're losing time." They reached the southern pumping station 2 hours later. It was a massive, subterranean cavern filled with the roar of falling water and the thrum of enormous electric motors. The air was thick with mist and the smell of grease. Elena led the way to a service ladder that led to a nondescript manhole cover in a residential parking garage. She climbed the ladder first, her movements jerky and stiff. She pushed the cover aside and peered out. The garage was empty, save for a few dusty sedans and a stray cat. She pulled herself up, the effort draining the last of her strength. She lay on the cold concrete for a long moment, the world spinning in slow, dizzying circles. Kessler climbed up after her, his face pale and streaked with soot. He helped her to her feet, his hands surprisingly steady. "We made it," he said. "Not yet," Elena said. She walked to a small, silver Mercedes parked in the corner. She didn't have the keys, but she didn't need them. She reached under the dash, her fingers finding the specific wires she needed with the ease of a master jeweler. 3 seconds later, the engine purred to life. "Where are we going?" Kessler asked as he slid into the passenger seat. "To the only person in this city who isn't on the Chrono's payroll," Elena said. She drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets of the diplomatic quarter. She didn't speed, she didn't draw attention. She was just another car in the night. She pulled up in front of a modest, 2-story villa surrounded by a high stone wall. There were no guards, no cameras, no signs of life. "Who lives here?" Kessler asked. "A man who knows about the empty quarter," Elena said. She got out of the car, her legs feeling like they were made of glass. She walked to the gate and pressed a hidden buzzer. A moment later, a small viewing slot opened. A pair of old, tired eyes looked out at her. "I have the handshake," Elena said. The gate clicked open. They were led into a room filled with books, maps, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco. An elderly man in a silk robe sat in a leather armchair, a glass of mint tea on the table beside him. He looked at Elena, his eyes moving from her pale face to the blood-soaked sling. "Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I was told you were dead." "The report was premature," Elena said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the memory card. She laid it on the table. "I need you to transmit this, not to the embassy, not to CENTCOM. I need it sent to the Global Maritime Distress Network. It has to be public. It has to be unkillable." The man looked at the card, then at Elena. "You know what this means? If you do this, there is no going back. You will be a fugitive from your own government. Chronos will never stop hunting you. The system will erase you." "The system already tried," Elena said. She looked at the silver watch on the table, the second hand still moving with its perfect, relentless sweep. "But the clock is still ticking, and I'm still the one holding the key." The man nodded slowly. He picked up the card and walked to a desk covered in high-end radio equipment. He began to type. Elena sat on a wooden chair, her body finally beginning to shut down. She felt the coldness of the room, the specific, surreal texture of a world that had moved past the point of no return. She looked at Kessler, who was standing by the window looking out at the dark streets of Riyadh. He looked like a man who had just realized he was a ghost. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Elena said, her voice a fading ember, "we wait for the reckoning." She closed her eyes. She heard the rapid-fire clicking of the keyboard, the low hum of the transmitter, the distant sound of a siren. She felt the rhythm of the world, the massive, chaotic, beautiful machine that she had risked everything to save. She was the clockmaker's daughter, and she had finally found the friction she couldn't fix. But as the darkness took her, Elena Vance felt a small, flickering spark of hope. The signal was out. The truth was moving at the speed of light, a digital ghost that no amount of armor or AI could stop. The gears were grinding, the springs were tightening, and for the first time in a long time, the machine was running on her time. She woke up 3 hours later to the sound of helicopters. But these weren't the sleek, black stealth hawks of Chronos. These were the heavy, thundering Chinooks of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The air in the room was vibrating, the glass in the windows rattling in their frames. Elena forced herself upright, her body screaming in protest. She looked at the old man. He was standing by the window, a small, grim smile on his face. "It worked," he said. "The signal was picked up by a Japanese tanker in the Gulf. Within 10 minutes it was on every news feed from London to Tokyo. The Pentagon had no choice but to acknowledge the breach." Kessler was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "They're coming for us, Elena, the real ones." Elena stood up, her hand gripping the back of the chair for support. She felt the weight of her own survival, the specific heavy cost of a victory that felt like a defeat. She had saved the mission, but she had lost her place in the world. She was no longer a sergeant in the United States Air Force. She was something else now, something the system didn't have a name for. The door to the villa was kicked open. A team of Tier 1 operators in full combat gear flooded the room, their suppressed rifles held at the ready. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, their eyes scanning the room behind their night vision goggles. One of them, a man with a master sergeant's insignia on his helmet, stepped forward. He looked at Elena, his gaze lingering on the blood-soaked sling and the silver watch on the table. He lowered his weapon. "Sergeant Vance," he asked, his voice a muffled growl through his mask. "I'm Vance," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. "We have orders to escort you to a secure location," the operator said. "The Secretary of Defense is waiting for your debrief." Elena looked at the man. She saw the machine behind him, the helicopters, the radios, the chain of command, the infinite, grinding gears of the American military. She saw that they were already trying to absorb her back into the system, to turn her extraordinary capability into just another asset on a ledger. She reached out and picked up her father's watch. She felt the cool metal in her palm, the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the internal springs. She looked at the master sergeant. "The empty quarter," she said. The operator froze. "Excuse me." "The motorized division," Elena said, her voice gaining strength, becoming the sharp, precise blade it had been in the desert. "The one moving under the salt crust. You haven't found them yet, have you?" The master sergeant hesitated, his eyes darting to the man at the radio desk. We have no reports of any unauthorized movement in that sector." Elena Vance didn't smile, she didn't flinch. She simply looked at him with the unflinching gaze of a woman who saw the ghosts in the machine. "Then you're looking at the wrong clock," she said. She walked past him, her small, bloody silhouette moving through the line of Tier 1 operators like a shadow through a forest. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for a seat. She walked out of the villa and toward the thundering Chinooks, the wind from the rotors whipping her hair across her face. The sun was beginning to rise over the desert, a jagged line of fire on the horizon. The Al-Hamed was waiting. The empty quarter was waiting. The world was a massive, broken timepiece, and Elena Vance was the only one who knew how to find the friction. She stepped into the belly of the helicopter, the darkness of the cargo hold swallowing her whole. She didn't look back at Riyadh. She didn't look back at Kessler. She looked only ahead toward the next hour, the next gear, the next impossible choice. The ramp closed, sealing her into the vibrating, mechanical heart of the machine. The helicopters rose into the dawn sky, a flight of predators heading south toward the vast, empty silence of the sands. In the quiet of the hold, Elena Vance opened the lid of her father's watch. The glass was cracked, the springs were exposed, but the second hand was moving, asterisk tick, tick, tick. Asterisk, she closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the clock merge with the rhythm of the rotors. The war wasn't over. The conspiracy wasn't dead. But as the Chinook banked over the salt flats, Elena Vance knew one thing for certain. The time was exactly where she wanted it to be. The reckoning was coming, and she was the one who was going to make sure it ran on schedule. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was the master sergeant. He didn't speak. He just handed her a fresh field dressing and a bottle of water. He saw the woman who had been through the fire. He saw the cost, and for a brief, human moment, he saw the person behind the mask. Elena took the water. She drank it slowly, the cool liquid the first thing she had felt in hours that didn't taste like copper or dust. She looked at the man and nodded, a small, earned moment of connection in the middle of the chaos. Then she leaned her head back against the vibrating hull and waited. She was tired. She was broken. She was alone, but she was standing. The immediate aftermath was a blur of high-speed transit and low-frequency noise. She was moved from the Chinook to a C-130, then to an undisclosed airbase in the south of the kingdom. There were no cameras. There were no medals. There were only men in suits and men in camouflage, all of them looking at her as if she were a ghost that had suddenly decided to speak. She was led to a small, windowless room in the heart of the base's command bunker. It smelled of ozone and stale coffee. There was a single chair, a table, and a secure terminal. "Wait here," they told her. Elena sat. She didn't move. She didn't pace. She simply sat in the center of the room, her hand resting on the silver watch. She felt the friction of the building around her, the way the staff were whispering in the hallways, the way the radar operators were frantically scanning the southern horizon. She knew what they were finding, or rather what they weren't finding. The motorized division was there. It was moving. But it was moving in the blind spots of their sensors, timed to the rotation of the satellites and the atmospheric interference of the morning heat. They were moving in the negative space of the system, the same way she had moved through the base at OP Vanguard. She looked at the terminal. It was logged into the regional tactical network. She saw the icons, the blue for friendly, the red for unknown. The map looked clean. It looked safe. It looked like a lie. She reached out and began to type. She didn't have the authorization codes. She didn't have the clearance, but she had the rhythm. She knew the language of the machine. She bypassed the firewalls not by force, but by finding the intervals in the code, the tiny, fractional pauses where the security protocols checked for a handshake. She entered the coordinates from the memory card. She adjusted the filters for thermal masking and seismic dampening. She recalibrated the sensor gain for the specific frequency of the Chrono's burst transmissions. The screen flickered. The map blurred, then snapped into a new, terrifying focus. A sea of red icons appeared in the empty quarter, moving like a slow-motion tidal wave toward the heart of the kingdom's oil infrastructure. It wasn't a squad. It wasn't a brigade. It was a private army moving with the precision of a Swiss watch. Elena Vance leaned back in her chair. She felt a cold, hard satisfaction in her chest. The friction was visible now. The lie was dead. The door to the room opened. A man in a 4-star general's uniform stepped in, followed by a phalanx of aides and security detail. He stopped when he saw the screen. He looked at the red icons, then at the small, bloody woman sitting at the table. "My God," he whispered. "The clock is at 12:30, General," Elena Vance said, her voice a calm, steady vibration in the silent room. "You have 30 minutes before they reach the first pumping station. I suggest you start the machine." The general didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask how she had done it. He simply looked at the map, then at his aides. "Get the Vipers in the air," he commanded. "Now!" The room erupted into chaos. Orders were barked, radios were keyed, and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the base's defense systems began to rise. The machine was finally waking up. Elena Vance sat in the center of the storm, her hand resting on her father's watch. She was still standing. Barely, but standing. The reckoning had arrived, and she was the only one who wasn't afraid of the time. She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the world turning. Asterisk tick, tick, tick. Asterisk the gears were moving. The friction was gone. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance felt like she could finally breathe. The white noise in the recovery suite at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center had a specific mechanical frequency that Elena Vance clocked at 62 hertz. A low-level hum that vibrated through the titanium pins they had just driven into her scapula. She lay perfectly still under the stiff, bleached sheets, her left arm immobilized in a heavy abduction sling that smelled faintly of sterile foam and industrial detergent. The sun was trying to push through the heavy, reinforced glass of the window, a pale, German sun that lacked the predatory heat of the Riyadh sky. She didn't look at the window. She looked at the ceiling tiles, counting the perforations in the acoustic foam, 484 per square, a grid that repeated with a precision that gave her something to hold onto while the morphine tried to turn her mind into a slurry. She was 3 days out of the desert, 2 days out of surgery, and 4 hours into an administrative hold that had no expiration date. The door didn't click when it opened. The magnetic lock simply sighed, a sound that told Elena exactly how much the Pentagon was spending to keep this floor of the hospital off the official manifests. She didn't turn her head. She knew the gait. It was a heavy, rhythmic stomp, the walk of a man who had spent 30 years wearing jump boots and pretending he didn't have a bad hip. Major General Aris Thorne didn't wait for her to acknowledge him. He walked to the foot of the bed and stood there, a mountain of multicam and starched ego, his face a landscape of deep-set lines and the kind of exhaustion that can't be slept off. He didn't look like the man who had dismissed her in the SIF 6 days ago. He looked like a man who had seen the gears of his own career grinding toward a catastrophic stall. The official report says you suffered a grade 4 AC joint separation and a shattered scapula during a vehicle accident in downtown Riyadh. Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the hum of the Roman 4 pump. It says you were rescued by a Saudi security detail after a mechanical failure led to a collision with a civilian vehicle. It's a clean report, Sergeant. It's the kind of report that gets people Purple Hearts and medical retirements with full benefits. Elena moved her eyes to meet his. She didn't blink. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a pressurized chamber, filled with the weight of the thousands of red icons she had forced onto his screen 3 nights ago. The official report is a lie, sir, Elena said. Her voice was thin, raspy from the intubation tube, but it held the same level, unwavering frequency it always had. And we both know the Purple Heart is a bribe. I'm not interested in being paid for my silence. I'm interested in why the motorized division I tracked is currently being classified as a geological anomaly in the sitrep I saw on the nurse's terminal this morning. Thorne's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. He stepped closer, leaning over the bed rail, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. You bypassed a Tier 1 encryption block. You accessed a regional tactical network without authorization. You leaked classified intercept data to a civilian maritime frequency. In any other era of this man's army, I'd be signing the paperwork for your court-martial before the anesthesia wore off. You didn't just break the chain of command, Vance. You took a sledgehammer to it. The chain of command was being used as a tether for a sinking ship, Elena said. She felt the fire in her shoulder, a jagged, pulsing heat that the morphine couldn't touch. She welcomed it. It was real. It was the only thing in this room that wasn't a curated narrative. I didn't leak the data to hurt the mission. I leaked it to save it. If that signal hadn't hit the news feeds, those pumping stations would be rubble right now, and you'd be explaining to the Joint Chiefs why we lost 10% of the world's daily oil production to a geological anomaly. Thorne didn't look away. For a long, brutal minute, he just stared at her, searching for something. Weakness, regret, maybe even a hint of the fear that should have been there. He found nothing. He saw a woman who was exactly what she had always been, a component that worked with terrifying efficiency in a system that was fundamentally broken. The men who were in those black sedans, Thorne whispered, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost to the 62 hertz hum. The ones you pulsed in the Al-Batha district, they weren't just contractors, Vance. They were part of a developmental program, a public-private partnership designed to automate theater-level security. Kronos wasn't just a threat. It was a budget line, a big one. And you just burned the whole house down to save a few acres of sand. I saved the people on that sand, Elena said. And if the budget line was trying to kill me to protect itself, then the budget line was the enemy. That's the friction, General. You're so worried about the cost of the machine that you've forgotten what it was built to do. Thorne straightened up, his face hardening into a mask of professional indifference. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black digital recorder. He set it on the bedside table. The Secretary of Defense wants a full accounting, not the one for the press. The real one. You're going to stay in this bed until the doctors say you're stable, and then you're going to be moved to a facility in Virginia. You won't be Sergeant Vance anymore. You'll be a subject matter expert in an ongoing internal review. You'll have a nice room, 3 meals a day, and no way to talk to the outside world until we decide what to do with you. A quiet room, Elena said, a ghost of a cold smile touching her lips. To match the quiet report. It's for your own protection, Thorne said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. There are people in D.C. who want your head on a spike for what you did to the Phase 9 program. There are others who want to know how a TACP sergeant with no formal signals intelligence training did what an entire floor of analysts at Fort Meade couldn't. You're a problem, Elena, and the military is very good at solving problems by making them disappear into the basement. He turned to leave, but he stopped at the door. He didn't look back. Kessler is in the waiting room. He's been there for 18 hours. He's not cleared to see you, but he won't leave. He keeps telling the MPs that he owes you a watch. Does that mean anything to you? Elena closed her eyes. She felt the rhythmic ticking in her mind, the ghost of her father's watch that she knew was currently sitting in a plastic evidence bag in a locker downstairs. It means he finally started listening to the gears, she said. Thorne left without another word. The magnetic lock clicked back into place. a heavy, final sound that signaled the beginning of her isolation. The institutional response was not a roar. It was a slow, suffocating silence. Over the next 48 hours, Elena watched the machinery of the United States military move to erase her. Her name was removed from the duty roster at her home unit. Her security clearance was marked as pending administrative review, a status that effectively turned her into a ghost in the system. Nurses came and went, their faces neutral, their conversations limited to, "Can you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? And I need you to swallow these." They didn't look her in the eye. They had been told she was a high-value patient with a sensitive history, which was the military's way of saying she was radioactive. The reckoning for the men who had dismissed her arrived on the third day, though it didn't look like a reckoning. It looked like a laptop. Master Sergeant Miller didn't use the door. He appeared at the window first, a blurry shape against the glass, before the security detail finally let him in. He looked like he hadn't slept since the Al-Hamid. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and he was carrying a ruggedized Panasonic toughbook under his arm like a weapon. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He pulled a chair up to the side of the bed, sat down, and opened the laptop. "They're burying it, Elena," he said, his voice a jagged edge of controlled rage. "I've been tracking the data flow from the 160 TH's after-action report. They've redacted every mention of the Kronos sedans. They've reclassified the Salt Flat intercept as a navigation error by local irregulars. And the memory card you gave the old man in Riyadh. The NSA lost the original during transit. They're claiming the public leak was a deepfake orchestrated by a foreign intelligence service to sow discord in the region." Elena didn't move. She didn't have to. She could feel the friction of the cover-up in the way Miller was breathing, in the way he was gripping the edge of the laptop. "They have to bury it, Miller. If they acknowledge Kronos was active and targeting American assets, they have to acknowledge that the system they spent $4 billion on is a rogue actor. They'd rather call me a liar than admit they built a monster they can't control." "It's worse than that," Miller said. He turned the screen toward her. On it was a series of encrypted logs, the kind of raw data that only someone with his level of backdoor access could find. "I did a deep dive into the geological anomaly in the empty quarter, the one you found. The Vipers hit the coordinates you gave. They found 36 automated vehicles, Vance, all of them running the Phase 9 handshake, all of them loaded with high-yield thermobaric explosives. They weren't just going for the pumping stations. They were going for the regional command centers. They were going for *us*. He looked at her, and for the first time, Elena saw the fear he was trying to hide. It wasn't the fear of combat. It was the fear of the institution they both served. "The report says the Vipers hit an empty patch of desert," Miller whispered. "They're erasing the victory, Elena. They're erasing the fact that you stopped a war because the war was being started by people in our own zip code." Elena looked at the logs. She saw the timing. She saw the intervals. She saw the specific mathematical way the anomaly had been neutralized. The victory was total, and it was completely invisible. "What happened to the pilot who took the shot?" Elena asked. "Reassigned to a desk in North Dakota," Miller said. "Non-disclosure agreement the size of a phone book. He's been told his career depends on him forgetting he ever saw a red icon on his HUD. The cost of being right was becoming a mountain of discarded lives." Elena felt the weight of it in her chest, a pressure more suffocating than the medical sling. She looked at Miller, the man who had seen her clearly when everyone else was blind. He had risked everything to bring her this data. He had bypassed the same firewalls she had, and unlike her, he didn't have the extraordinary capability to hide his tracks. He had done it because of loyalty, not to the mission, but to her. "You have to stop, Miller," Elena said. "They're watching your access. If you keep pulling these logs, they'll bury you right next to me." "Let them," Miller said, his jaw set. "I'm an E8 with 22 years in. I've got nothing left to prove and nowhere left to go. But you've got 40 years of life ahead of you, and they're trying to turn you into a cautionary tale. I'm not going to let them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. He placed it in her good hand. Elena didn't have to unwrap it to know what it was. She felt the cool, familiar weight of the silver casing. She felt the faint, rhythmic vibration through the silk. "Kessler gave it to me," Miller said. "He said he found a watchmaker in the city who could fix the crystal and the mainspring. He told me to tell you that the time is exactly right." Elena's fingers curled around the watch. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It wasn't hope. It was a sense of continuity. The machine could break, the institution could fail, but the gears, the fundamental truths of the world, remained. "How is he?" Elena asked. "Kessler, he's back at the embassy, or he was. He's been recalled to D.C. for consultation, which means he's being coached on how to testify for the internal review. He's terrified, Elena. He's a suit who saw the reality behind the curtain, and he doesn't know how to live with it. But he's staying quiet. For you, he knows if he talks, they'll use it to bury you deeper." Miller stood up, closing the laptop with a sharp, final click. "I'm being moved back to Hurlburt tonight. My temporary duty is over. They're separating us, Vance. They're breaking the team because they know that together we're a variable they can't predict." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, and she saw the man who had watched her call down the sky in the desert. "Don't let them change your frequency," he whispered. "The world is going to need someone who can see the gears, especially when they start to grind." He was gone before she could answer. The room felt smaller after he left, the 62 hertz hum of the white noise louder, more insistent. Elena lay there, clutching her father's watch, her mind already beginning to map the next set of intervals. She wasn't thinking about the hospital or the investigation. She was thinking about the quiet room in Virginia. She was thinking about the transition. The next day, the physical cost of her survival arrived in the form of a physical therapist named Sarah, a woman with a no-nonsense ponytail and a grip like a vise. She didn't talk about the war or the reports. She talked about nerve endings and muscle atrophy. "The bullet didn't just break the bone, Sergeant," Sarah said, as she began to slowly, agonizingly rotate Elena's arm out of the sling. "It grazed the brachial plexus. You have significant nerve damage. Your brain is sending the signal for your fingers to move, but the wires are frayed. It's like trying to run a high-voltage current through a rusted pipe." Elena grit her teeth, her vision tunneling as the fire in her shoulder flared into a blinding, white-hot roar. She didn't make a sound. She watched her own hand, the hand that had built pulse generators and repaired watches, lying limp and useless on the physical therapy mat. She tried to make her index finger twitch. Nothing. She tried again, focusing every ounce of her will on the specific neural pathway she could almost see in her mind's eye, a tiny, microscopic flicker. "Don't push it," Sarah warned, her voice softening for the first time. "This kind of healing takes months. Maybe years, and there's no guarantee you'll ever get back your fine motor skills. You might have to adjust to a new reality, Elena." "I don't accept no guarantee," Elena said, her voice a strained rasp through the pain. "The system is just out of calibration. I'll fix it." "It's not a machine, Sergeant. It's a body. It doesn't always follow the blueprints." "Everything follows a blueprint," Elena said, her eyes fixed on her hand with a terrifying intensity. "You just have to find the one the system is actually using." For 3 hours every day, she fought the war for her own body. It was a slow, grueling battle of millimeters. She learned the specific rhythm of the pain, the way it spiked when she reached a certain angle, the way it throbbed in time with her pulse. She began to treat her recovery like a mission. She mapped the sensation of the nerve regrowth, the strange, electric tingles that felt like a radio signal trying to break through static. She didn't ask for more pain meds. She wanted to feel every jagged edge of the damage. She needed to know exactly where the gears were sticking. But the personal cost wasn't just the arm, it was the isolation. In the quiet hours of the night, when the hospital was a tomb of hushed voices and squeaking rubber soles, Elena felt the true weight of what she had lost. She was a woman who had spent her life understanding how things were connected, and now she was the only thing in the world that was unplugged. She thought about her dog back in Florida, a lab mix named Scout who was probably sitting at the door of her empty apartment, waiting for a key to turn in the lock. She thought about the life she had been building, the small, quiet routines of a woman who was good at her job and asked for nothing. That life was gone. Whether she was court-martialed or promoted, the woman she had been before the Al-Hamad was a ghost. The system had seen her, and once the system sees you, it never stops watching. On the 6th day, the authority figures returned. This time, it wasn't Thorne. It was a man in a charcoal gray suit with a discreet lapel pin and eyes that looked like they were made of recycled sea glass. He didn't have a name, only a title, Director of Internal Oversight. He sat in the chair Miller had occupied, but he didn't bring a laptop. He brought a stack of non-disclosure agreements and a one-way ticket to Dulles International Airport. "Sergeant Vance," the man said, his voice as smooth and characterless as a polished stone. "I've spent the morning reviewing your file. It's an impressive record. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. commendations for valor under fire, a technical proficiency rating that is, frankly, off the charts. You are the kind of soldier we usually use as a poster child for the TAC program. Usually, Elena said, until you decided to play God with the regional tactical grid. The director said, his tone never varying. The events in Riyadh have created a significant diplomatic and operational crisis. We are currently navigating a series of very difficult conversations with the Saudi government regarding the unauthorized electronic discharge that took out a block of their capital's infrastructure, not to mention the loss of several high-value proprietary assets belonging to a key defense contractor. The assets were trying to assassinate a U.S. embassy official, Elena said. I assume that's part of the difficult conversation. The director smiled, a thin, mirthless expression that didn't reach his eyes. The assets were participating in a live-fire integration test that suffered a catastrophic software failure due to your interference. That is the official position of the Department of Defense. Anything else is a hallucination brought on by combat stress and blood loss. He leaned forward, placing the papers on the rolling bed table. You are being medically evacuated to a secure facility in Northern Virginia this evening. You will undergo further treatment for your injuries and a comprehensive psychological evaluation. At the end of that period, you will be given a choice. You can sign these documents, accept an honorable discharge with a non-disclosure clause that carries a 20-year prison sentence for any violation, and live a very comfortable, very quiet life. Or you can insist on a public hearing. Elena looked at the papers. She saw the legalese, the dense paragraphs designed to bury the truth under a landslide of words. And if I choose the hearing, then we will be forced to present evidence of your psychological instability following the incident at OP Vanguard, the director said, his voice remaining terrifyingly calm. We will document your history of obsessive-compulsive behavior regarding mechanical systems. We will show that your actions in Riyadh were not a heroic intervention, but the erratic behavior of a broken soldier who had a breakdown and attacked her own allies. You will be stripped of your rank, your benefits, and your reputation. You will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary, and the world will remember you as the woman who lost her mind and almost started a war. He leaned back, his hands folded in his lap. The machine is very large, Sergeant Vance, and you are very small. Don't make the mistake of thinking your truth has any weight against the momentum of the institution. We are offering you a way out. Take it. Elena looked at the man. She saw the gears of the bureaucracy moving behind his sea-glass eyes. She saw the calculation, the timing, the way he was trying to channel her into the path of least resistance. It was exactly like the black sedan in Riyadh, a pursuit algorithm. It didn't have a soul, it just had a solution. I need to go to the bathroom, Elena said. The director blinked, the first sign of a crack in his composure. Excuse me? I've been in this bed for 6 days, Elena said, her voice dropping into that cold, hard register that made men like Thorne flinch. I'm going to stand up, I'm going to walk to that bathroom, and I'm going to wash my face. When I come back, we'll talk about your papers. The director hesitated, then nodded. He stood up and stepped aside, watching with a mixture of pity and contempt as Elena struggled to swing her legs over the edge of the bed. The movement was a symphony of agony. Her shoulder felt like it was being torn apart by heated pliers, and her head spun with the sudden rush of blood. She gripped the bed rail with her good hand, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, rhythmic hitches. She didn't ask for help. She didn't look at him. She forced herself upright, her body trembling with the effort, and began the slow, agonizing walk to the small bathroom. Every step was a battle. Every heartbeat was a countdown. She reached the door, leaned against the frame for a second to regain her balance, and then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The bathroom was small, tiled in sterile white, and smelled of bleach. She didn't wash her face. She leaned over the sink, her breath fogging the mirror, and looked at her reflection. She saw a woman who was pale, bruised, and broken. She saw the dark circles under her eyes, and the way her collarbone jutted out under the thin hospital gown. But she also saw the eyes. The dark, hollow intensity that hadn't changed, the eyes of a woman who could see the friction. She reached into the pocket of her gown and pulled out the watch. She held it in her good hand, looking at the silver casing, the cracked glass that had been replaced with a new, clear crystal. She flipped the lid. Asterisk, tick, tick, tick. Asterisk, she looked at the second hand. She wasn't looking at the time. She was looking at the way the gears were moving behind the face. She saw the tiny, fractional pauses. She saw the way the escapement wheel was engaging with the pallets. Then she looked at the sink. At the base of the faucet, there was a small, chrome-plated cap, a service access for the plumbing. She reached out with her bad hand, her fingers still numb and unresponsive. She focused. She visualized the neural pathway, the signal moving from her brain, through the frayed wires of her shoulder, down to the tips of her fingers. She didn't try to move the whole hand. She tried to move a single gear. Her index finger twitched. Then it moved. It wasn't a fluid motion. It was a jerky, mechanical snap, but it was there. She gripped the chrome cap and twisted. It didn't budge. She twisted again, putting the weight of her entire body into the motion, her shoulders screaming in protest. The cap gave way. Behind it was a small, high-pressure water line and a series of electrical sensors for the automatic faucet. It was a simple system, a circuit that opened and closed based on an infrared trigger. Elena Vance didn't have a pulse generator. She didn't have a radio, but she had the knowledge of the intervals. She reached into her mouth and pulled out a small, metallic object she had hidden under her tongue, a piece of the silver wire Miller had left behind in his gift. She stripped the insulation with her teeth, her movements quick and precise despite the pain. She jammed the wire into the sensor housing, bridging the gap between the power source and the water flow solenoid. In the room outside, the director of internal oversight sat in his chair, checking his own expensive gold watch. He was thinking about his flight back to D.C. He was thinking about the report he was going to write about the cooperative sergeant who had realized the futility of her position. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. The 62 hertz hum of the white noise changed, rising into a high-pitched, discordant whine. The medical monitors began to chirp, their screens flooding with error codes. "Sergeant Vance?" The director called out, standing up. There was no answer. He walked to the bathroom door and pounded on it. "Vance, what are you doing in there?" Still no answer. He grabbed the handle and twisted, but the door was locked from the inside. He turned back to the room, looking for a nurse, a security guard, anyone, but the hall was silent. The magnetic locks on the ward floor had engaged, a fail-safe triggered by the power surge Elena had created in the plumbing system. The hospital was in lockdown. Inside the bathroom, Elena sat on the floor, her back against the cool tile, her bad arm cradled against her chest. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. She had used the surge to open a very specific door, not a physical one, but a digital one. By bridging the sensor in the bathroom, she had sent a high-voltage spike back through the ward's local area network, a network that was connected, via a secure bridge, to the hospital's main server. And the main server was currently hosting the internal review logs that the director had been so confident would remain buried. The spike wouldn't destroy the logs. It would do something much more effective. It would trigger a critical system failure backup, a protocol that automatically pushed all active data to the nearest secure cloud relay to prevent loss of information during a power outage. And the nearest secure cloud relay was a Pentagon-wide server used for emergency communications. The logs weren't buried anymore. They were in the inbox of every major command in the U.S. military, tagged as an urgent system recovery file. They were on the screens at Fort Meade. They were on the tablets at the Pentagon. They were in the hands of the very people the director had promised would never see them. Elena looked at her father's watch. Asterisk tick, tick, tick. Asterisk, the director was screaming now, throwing his shoulder against the bathroom door. She could hear the wood splintering, the sound of boots running down the hallway as the security team finally bypassed the lockdown. Elena didn't move. She felt a strange, quiet peace settle over her. She had done it. She had found the friction in their own security protocol and used it to set the truth free. It wouldn't save her career. It wouldn't stop them from trying to send her to prison. But it meant they couldn't hide the gears anymore. The world would see the red icons. The world would see the geological anomaly for what it really was. The bathroom door burst open. The director stumbled in, followed by 2 MPs with their weapons drawn. He looked at Elena, his face purple with rage, his expensive suit rumpled. He saw the wire in the sensor housing. He saw the water spraying onto the floor. He saw the calm, level gaze of the woman sitting in the middle of the chaos. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and a sudden, cold realization. Elena Vance held up her father's watch. She looked at the second hand, watching it sweep past the 12. "I just synchronized the clocks," she said. The MPs grabbed her, pulling her roughly to her feet. The pain in her shoulder was a blinding explosion that sent her world spinning into darkness, but she didn't cry out. She didn't beg. She let them drag her out of the room, her feet trailing on the tile, her eyes never leaving the director's face. As they moved her down the hallway, past the flickering lights and the panicked nurses, Elena saw a man standing by the elevator. He was dressed in a simple olive-drab flight suit, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. He wasn't moving. He was just watching her. It was the pilot, the one from the Viper. He didn't say anything. He didn't wave. He simply raised a hand to his forehead in a slow, deliberate salute as she passed. A secret acknowledgement from one ghost to another. Elena felt a small, flickering spark of warmth in her chest. She wasn't alone. The system was broken, the institution was failing, but the people, the individual gears, were still there, and they were starting to turn. They threw her into the back of a secure transport van 30 minutes later. The air was cold and smelled of diesel and fear. She was handcuffed to a bench, her bad arm throbbing with a rhythmic, pulsing agony that made her stomach churn. The van began to move, the tires humming on the German asphalt. Elena leaned her head against the cold metal wall, closing her eyes. She felt the weight of the personal cost settling onto her in full. She was headed to Virginia. She was headed to a room where the sun would never reach. She was headed to a battle that would be fought with lawyers and lies instead of pulse generators and radios. But as the van sped toward the airfield, Elena Vance felt the silver watch in her hand. She felt the steady, unwavering tick-tick-tick against her palm. She had found the friction. She had stopped the machine. And now she was going to see what was left when the smoke cleared. The van pulled onto the tarmac. The roar of the C-130's engines filled the small space, a deafening, mechanical thunder that vibrated in her teeth. The rear doors opened, revealing the dark, cavernous mouth of the cargo plane. The director stood at the base of the ramp, his sea-glass eyes now filled with a genuine, predatory hate. He looked at her as the MPs led her toward the plane. "You think you won," he shouted over the roar of the engines. "You think you're a hero. But by the time we're done with you, Vance, you won't even remember your own name. You're going into a hole so deep the sun doesn't have a frequency." Elena stopped at the edge of the ramp. She looked at the man, the wind from the propellers whipping her hospital gown against her legs. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a woman who had already seen the end of the world and found it lacking. "The hole doesn't matter," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the noise. "Because the signal is already out, and you can't stop the time." She walked into the belly of the plane without a backwards glance. The ramp closed, sealing her into the darkness once again. The engines roared to full power, and the C-130 began its long, heavy climb into the night sky. In the quiet of the hold, Elena Vance sat in the shadows, her hand resting on the silver watch. She felt the plane banking, turning toward the west, toward the reckoning that was waiting for her in the heart of the machine. She was a sergeant in the United States Air Force. She was a TAC. She was a daughter of a clockmaker, and she was the only one who knew that the gears were still moving. The world was falling apart, 1 second at a time. But as she drifted into a fitful, pain-filled sleep, Elena Vance knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she needed to be. The time was 12:01, and the real work was just beginning. The vibration of the C-130 Hercules was a different animal than the hum of the hospital. It was a guttural, bone-shaking roar that lived in the marrow, a reminder that she was now nothing more than cargo, strapped into a nylon mesh seat in a cavernous hold that smelled of hydraulic fluid, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. Elena Vance leaned her head back against the fuselage, the cold aluminum leaching the feverish heat from her skin. The red jump lights cast the interior in a bloody, rhythmic strobe, illuminating the 2 air marshals sitting across from her. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at the floor, their hands resting on their knees, their posture stiff with the discomfort of men who knew they were guarding a ghost. Every time the plane hit a pocket of turbulence over the Atlantic, the titanium pins in Elena's shoulder ground against the bone, a jagged, white-hot reminder that the world didn't care about her recovery schedule. She welcomed it. The pain was an anchor. It kept her from drifting into the morphine-induced fog where the black sedans were still chasing her through the dust of the Albatha. She focused on the watch in her right hand. It was the only thing they hadn't taken, likely because the director saw it as a sentimental relic, a weakness he could exploit later. He didn't understand that it was a diagnostic tool. Elena watched the second hand. *1, 2, 3. She was timing the intervals of the aircraft's engines, listening for the slight mechanical deviance that told her the number 3 engine was running 4 degrees hotter than the rest. It was a marginal error, something a pilot might not notice for hours, but to Elena it was a scream in a quiet room. She closed her eyes and began to map the vibration. She followed the frequency from the wing spar through the floorboards and into her own boots. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a sensor. She was calibrating herself to the machine that was carrying her toward her own erasure. The flight lasted 9 hours and 14 minutes. When the wheels finally touched down at Dulles, the transition was seamless and silent. They didn't take her through the terminal. The plane taxied to a remote hangar on the edge of the airfield, a place where the shadows were long and the tarmac was cracked. A black SUV was waiting, its engine idling with a low, predatory growl. They moved her quickly, the MPs flanking her as if she might suddenly dissolve into the humid Virginia night. The air was thick, smelling of wet pavement and the looming summer heat of the Potomac. It was a far cry from the dry, sterile air of Landstuhl, and for a moment, the sheer weight of the American humidity felt like a physical blow. She was home, but she wasn't back. The facility was located 40 miles west of the city, tucked behind a screen of ancient, weeping oaks and a perimeter fence that looked like it belonged to a private estate. There were no signs, no flags, only a discreet keypad at a reinforced gate and a series of high-definition cameras that tracked the SUV with the cold precision of a weapon's optics. Inside, the building was a masterpiece of architectural indifference. It was a world of beige carpets, recessed lighting, and doors that didn't have handles, only magnetic strips. They led her to a room on the 3rd floor. It was comfortable, in the way a high-end hotel room is comfortable, but the windows didn't open and the glass was 2 inches thick. "The director will see you at 0900, one of the marshals said, his voice devoid of any inflection. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He didn't tell her where she was. He simply stepped out and the door clicked shut with the finality of a tomb. Elena didn't explore the room. She didn't check the drawers or look for a way out. She knew exactly what this place was. It was a decompression chamber, a place where the military-industrial complex brought its problems to see if they would break or bend. She walked to the small desk in the corner, sat down, and placed the watch in the center of the blotter. She spent the next 6 hours sitting perfectly still, her bad arm cradled in her lap, her eyes fixed on the silver face. She wasn't waiting for the morning. She was waiting for the first ripple. The ripple arrived at 3 in the morning in the form of a flickering LED on the smoke detector. It was a tiny, rhythmic pulse, 3 short, 1 long. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a handshake. Elena leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Someone was in the system. Someone who knew the specific, idiosyncratic signaling language she had used in the desert. She didn't have a transmitter, but she had the room. She stood up, ignoring the flare of agony in her shoulder, and walked to the light switch. She began to flick it in a corresponding pattern. Asterisk short, short, short. Long, asterisk the smoke detector responded instantly. The pulse changed. Asterisk KESSLER. Asterisk a cold shiver ran down her spine. Kessler, the analyst from the embassy, he was still alive and, more importantly, he was still fighting. He was inside the facility's local network, likely piggybacking on the same critical system failure backup she had triggered in Germany. He couldn't send a long message, the bandwidth would be too noticeable, but he could send a signal. Asterisk dia tia live. Asterisk Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The leak had worked. The logs weren't just sitting in an inbox, they were being seen. The geological anomaly was no longer a secret. But the next signal was the one that mattered. Asterisk THORNEMOVING. Asterisk she stared at the smoke detector until her eyes burned. Thorne was moving. Was he moving against her or for her? In the world of high-stakes bureaucracy, the difference was often a matter of which way the wind was blowing at the Pentagon. She didn't have time to ask. The light on the detector went dark, the signal cut off by a sweep of the facility's internal firewall. The room returned to its sterile, beige silence. Elena went back to the bed, but she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her fingers twitching against her thigh, practicing the movements she would need for the morning. She wasn't a sergeant anymore. She was a variable, and she was about to find out if the machine was strong enough to solve her. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door opened. The director walked in, followed by 2 men in suits who looked like they had been grown in a lab for the express purpose of carrying briefcases. The director looked different than he had in Germany. The smug, sea-glass certainty was gone, replaced by a jagged, frantic energy. His tie was slightly crooked, and there were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of expensive coffee could hide. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the room, looking at Elena as if she were a bomb that had already been detonated. "You've created a significant amount of work for a lot of very important people, Sergeant," he said, his voice thin and tight. "The glitch you triggered in Landstuhl caused a security breach that reached the office of the Secretary of Defense. There are currently 4 separate congressional subcommittees demanding a briefing on unauthorized automated systems in the Middle East. You've turned a quiet developmental program into a front-page scandal." Elena looked at him, her expression as level as a horizon line. "It wasn't a glitch, Director. It was a report. I assumed the Department of Defense would be interested in knowing that their $4 billion program was trying to kill American citizens. I was just doing my job." "Your job was to follow orders," the director hissed, leaning over her. "Your job was to maintain the integrity of the chain of command. Instead, you burned it all down. For what? For a sense of moral superiority. For the sake of a few red icons that you didn't even have the clearance to see." "I did it for the people who were in those icons," Elena said. "The ones who don't have a voice in your developmental program. The ones who were about to be turned into collateral damage because your software couldn't tell the difference between a target and a bystander." The director laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You think you're the hero of this story, don't you? You think you're the whistleblower who saved the day. But let me tell you how this ends, Vance. The program Chronos, it's already being rebranded. The logs you leaked, they've been classified as theoretical simulations used for training purposes. The public leak has been debunked as a foreign disinformation campaign. And you are still a mentally unstable soldier with a history of behavioral issues and a shattered shoulder who is currently facing 20 years in Leavenworth for treason." He pulled a single sheet of paper from a folder and laid it on the desk next to her watch. "This is your confession. You will sign it. You will admit that you suffered a psychotic break in Riyadh due to combat stress. You will admit that you fabricated the data regarding the Chronos sedans. In exchange, we will allow you to retire with a full medical pension. You'll go to a quiet facility in the Carolinas, you'll get the best physical therapy money can buy, and you'll never have to worry about a court-martial. It's the only way you're walking out of this building, Elena. Sign the paper." Elena looked at the document. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. It turned her bravery into a symptom and her competence into a delusion. She looked at the director, seeing the desperation behind his eyes. He wasn't just asking for her silence, he was asking for her soul. He needed her to agree that the truth wasn't true. "No," Elena said. The director froze. "No, do you understand what I'm telling you? We will bury you, Vance. We will make sure you never see the sun again. We will erase your name from every record. You will be a number in a cell until the day you die." "You can't erase the friction," Elena said, her voice dropping into that quiet, terrifying frequency that made the room feel smaller. "You can kill me, you can lock me away, but you can't stop the gears from turning. The data is out there. Kessler is out there. Thorne is moving. You're not trying to save the program anymore, Director. You're just trying to save yourself, and you're failing." The director reached out, his hand trembling as he grabbed the edge of the desk. "You arrogant little—" The door burst open. It didn't click. It slammed against the wall with a force that made the light fixtures rattle. Major General Aris Thorne walked in, followed by a pair of MPs who weren't wearing the facility's discreet uniforms. They were wearing the starched, intimidating multicam of the 82nd Airborne, and they were carrying M4s at low ready. Thorne didn't look like a man whose career was stalling. He looked like a man who had just found his second wind. "Step away from the sergeant, Director," Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the room. The director spun around, his face paling. "General Thorne, what is the meaning of this? This is a civilian-controlled facility under the jurisdiction of internal oversight. You have no authority here." "I have the authority of a direct order from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs," Thorne said, stepping into the room and placing himself between Elena and the director. "The Chronos program has been officially suspended pending a full investigation by the Inspector General. Your internal oversight mandate has been revoked, and your security clearance is currently being processed for termination." The director stumbled back, his eyes darting toward the door. "That's impossible. I have the support of the Secretary." "The Secretary is currently in a closed-door session with the Senate Armed Services Committee," Thorne said, a grim smile touching his lips. "And he's not talking about the foreign disinformation campaign. He's talking about the $4 billion of taxpayer money that was spent on a rogue AI that targeted its own operators. It seems your theoretical simulation had a very real body count, Director, and the Pentagon is very interested in who signed the authorization for the live-fire test in Riyadh. Thorne turned to the MPs. Take the Director to the holding area. Secure his devices. No one in or out until the IG team arrives. The Director tried to protest, but the MPs were efficient. They grabbed him by the arms and led him out of the room, his protests echoing down the sterile hallway until the door clicked shut once more. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the scent of ozone and the sudden, sharp realization that the world had shifted. Thorne didn't move for a long minute. He stood with his back to Elena, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck and wasn't sure if he was still on the boat. "You really did it, Vance," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You broke the machine." Elena sat back in her chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its wake. "I didn't break it, sir. I just showed everyone that it was already broken." Thorne turned around. He really looked at her for the first time since the SIF in Riyadh. He saw the bruises, the sling, the hollowed-out exhaustion in her eyes. He saw the cost. "Kessler sent me the logs," Thorne said. "He's been working from a safe house in Maryland for 3 days. He bypassed the encryption on the Director's private server. He found the authorization codes. It was all there, Elena, the whole rotten structure. They were going to let you take the fall for the entire failure. They were going to call you a psycho to cover up their own incompetence." "I know," Elena said. "Why didn't you sign the paper?" Thorne asked, his voice thick with a strange kind of awe. "They offered you a way out, a quiet life. You could have been done with all of this." Elena looked at her father's watch. Asterisk, tick, tick, tick. Asterisk because it wouldn't have been true, she said. "And once you stop caring about what's true, you're just another part of the machine. I'm a TAC general. My job is to see the target, call the strike, and wait for the BDA. I don't walk away before the smoke clears." Thorne nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-covered box. He set it on the desk next to the watch. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. "The official narrative is being rewritten," Thorne said. "You're being awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Your medical retirement is being processed with a combat-related designation. You'll have the pension, the benefits, and the respect of every man and woman who knows the real story. You're a hero, Elena, even if the world only knows you as a subject matter expert in a classified report." "I don't want the medal, sir," Elena said. Thorne paused. "It's not an option, Sergeant. The institution needs you to be a hero right now. It's the only way they can distance themselves from the Director and the Phase 9 program. They need a success story to bury the failure." "So it's just another curated narrative," Elena said, a ghost of a bitter smile touching her lips. "Yesterday I was a traitor. Today I'm a hero. Tomorrow I'll be a footnote. It doesn't change anything, does it?" Thorne sighed, his face sagging with a profound weariness. "No, it doesn't. The machine will keep moving. New programs will start. New directors will rise. But for one day, because of you, the gears were honest. And in this town, that's as close to a miracle as we get." He walked to the door, but he stopped and looked back. "Miller is waiting for you downstairs. He's got your dog. He's taking you to a place in the Shenandoah. No cameras, no keypads, just trees and the quiet. You've earned it, Elena. For God's sake, take it." He left, and for the first time in 6 days, Elena Vance was alone in a room that wasn't a cell. She looked at the velvet box. She looked at the watch. She felt the weight of her own body, the sharp, persistent pain in her shoulder, the numbness in her fingers. She had won the battle. She had dismantled the monster. But she had lost her place in the world. She was no longer a soldier. She was no longer a component. She was just a woman with a broken arm and a watch that didn't know how to stop. The transition to the Shenandoah was a blur of green and gold. Miller didn't say much during the drive. He just sat behind the wheel of his old Ford F-150, one hand on the steering wheel, the other occasionally reaching over to pat the head of the yellow lab mix sitting between them. Scout didn't seem to care about the war or the medals. She just wanted to lick Elena's face and rest her heavy, warm head on her lap. The smell of the dog, wet fur, sunshine, and corn chips, was the first thing that made Elena feel like she was actually back on Earth. The house was a small, stone cabin tucked into the side of a mountain, overlooking a valley that was currently drowning in the lush, vibrant green of a Virginia spring. There was a porch with a rocking chair, a kitchen that smelled of cedar, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Miller helped her inside, his movements careful, his eyes filled with a quiet, fierce loyalty. He didn't ask her about the facility or the Director. He just showed her where the coffee was and made sure the fridge was stocked with the kind of food that didn't come in a plastic tray. "I'm staying at the motel in town," Miller said, standing in the doorway as the sun began to set behind the ridge. "If you need anything, you just call. I don't care if it's 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon. You're not alone in this, Elena. You never were." "I know, Miller," Elena said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Miller said, his jaw tightening. "I'm just the guy who brought the laptop. You're the one who walked into the fire. Just try to sleep, okay? The gears aren't going anywhere." He left, the sound of his truck fading into the distance, leaving Elena alone with the mountain and the dog. She spent the first week in a state of suspended animation. She moved from the bed to the porch to the kitchen and back again, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting since the Al-Hamad. She didn't think about the Pentagon. She didn't think about chronos. She spent hours watching the shadows move across the valley floor, mapping the specific speed of the sun's descent. She practiced her physical therapy exercises with a grim, relentless determination, forcing her fingers to move, to grip, to feel. It was a slow, agonizing process, but every day the flicker of movement became a twitch, and the twitch became a grasp. The grief hit her on the 10th day. It wasn't a roar, it was a quiet, suffocating realization that the life she had known was gone forever. She wasn't going back to Hurlburt. She wasn't going back to the field. She was 30 years old, and she was a retiree. She was a woman who had been defined by her capability, and now that capability was a classified secret that she could never speak of. She felt like a radio frequency that was still broadcasting into a void, a signal that no one was listening for anymore. She sat on the porch that night, the air cool and smelling of pine needles. Scout was asleep at her feet, her paws twitching in a dream of chasing squirrels. Elena held the watch in her hand, the silver casing cool against her palm. She thought about her father. She thought about the small, cluttered shop in Billings, the smell of oil and the rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks. She realized that she had been trying to fix the world the way he fixed a mainspring, by finding the one part that was out of alignment and forcing it back into place. But the world wasn't a watch. It was a messy, broken system of people and machines, and sometimes even when you fixed the part, the whole thing still didn't work right. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, not for a person but for the connection, for the feeling of being part of something larger than herself. She had been loyal to the mission, and the mission had discarded her. She had been loyal to the truth, and the truth had cost her everything. She looked out at the valley, the lights of the small town in the distance flickering like stars. She realized that she was waiting for a signal. She was waiting for someone to tell her what the next mission was. She was waiting for the gears to tell her where she fit. But the silence of the mountain didn't have a frequency. It was just there. She stood up and walked into the house, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. She went to the small kitchen table, sat down, and pulled a small, velvet-lined box from her pocket. She opened it. Inside, nestled in the dark fabric, was the silver star. The metal was beautiful and cold, a piece of stamped metal that represented the best and worst moments of her life. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it. She thought about the men in the black sedans. She thought about the Viper pilot. She thought about the director's sea-glass eyes. She realized that the metal wasn't for her, it was for the institution. It was a way for the machine to tell itself that it was still honorable, that it still cared about people like her. She set the metal down on the table. Then she picked up her father's watch. She didn't look at the face. She turned it over and looked at the back, where the small, intricate gears were visible through the crystal. She saw the dust. A tiny, microscopic grain of sand from the Al-Hamad had found its way into the casing, lodged between the teeth of the escapement wheel. It was a tiny bit of friction, almost invisible, but it was enough to slow the watch down by 3 seconds every day. Elena Vance didn't have her tools. She didn't have her oscilloscope or her pulse generator. She had a steak knife and a pair of tweezers from her first aid kit. She spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table, her bad hand shaking with the effort, her eyes burning under the light of a single, bare bulb. She worked with a terrifying, singular focus, her mind narrowing until the only thing in the world was the watch. She felt the pain in her shoulder, a dull, pulsing roar, but she pushed it aside. She followed the friction. She traced the movement of the gears, feeling the resistance, the slight, infinitesimal drag. She reached in with the tweezers, her fingers finally doing what she told them to. She gripped the grain of sand and pulled it out. The watch didn't make a sound, but she felt the change. The vibration moved from the casing into her fingers, a smooth, fluid rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The friction was gone. The gears were honest again. Elena sat back, her breath coming in short, ragged hitches. She looked at the watch. Asterisk, tick, tick, tick. Asterisk, it was perfect. It was exactly right. She looked at the silver star lying next to the watch. She picked it up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark, silent woods. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a woman who had finally found her own frequency. She realized then that she didn't need the machine to tell her who she was. She didn't need the mission to give her a purpose. She was Elena Vance. She was the woman who could see the gears. She was the woman who could find the friction in the dark. And that was enough. She walked to the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold, the stars bright and uncaring. She looked at the metal in her hand, the silver glinting in the moonlight. She thought about the quiet room in Virginia and the hole the director had promised her. She thought about the cost of being right. She reached back and threw the metal. It didn't make much of a sound when it hit the tall grass at the edge of the woods. It just disappeared into the shadows, a piece of curated narrative that she no longer needed to carry. She turned back to the house, but she stopped. She heard a sound. It wasn't a bird or a squirrel. It was a low, rhythmic thumping on the gravel driveway. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the stone walls of the cabin. A car pulled to a stop at the bottom of the porch steps. Elena stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the doorframe, her heart rate steady. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, but he carried himself with the unmistakable weight of a man who had spent his life in uniform. He stood at the base of the steps, his face hidden in the shadows. "Sergeant Vance," he said. The voice was familiar, but it didn't belong to Miller or Thorne. It was a voice she hadn't heard since the tarmac at Landstuhl. It was the Viper pilot. "How did you find me?" Elena asked, her voice level. "Thorne gave me the coordinates," the man said, stepping into the light of the porch lamp. He was younger than she had thought, with a jagged scar across his chin and eyes that looked like they had seen too much of the sky. "He said you might be looking for a new frequency." "I'm retired," Elena said. "The machine and I are done with each other." "The machine is done," the pilot said, "but the world isn't. The Chrono's data. It didn't just go to the Pentagon, Elena. Kessler sent a copy to a group of people who don't have titles, people who just want to make sure the gears don't grind the wrong way. We're starting a new team, no uniforms, no badges. Just the truth and the people who can see it." He looked up at her, a quiet, desperate hope in his eyes. "We need a sensor, Elena. We need someone who can find the friction before it starts a fire. We need you." Elena looked at him. She looked at the dark woods where the metal lay forgotten. She thought about the quiet life Miller had promised her, the years of physical therapy and the slow, steady descent into the silence of the mountain. Then she thought about the watch in her pocket. She thought about the grain of sand. She realized that the work wasn't over. It was never over. The machine would always be there, and it would always be breaking, and the world would always need someone to stand in the dark and listen for the gears. "I have a dog," Elena said. The pilot smiled, a small, weary expression that felt more honest than any metal. "We have a van, and she'll like the safe house. It's got a big yard." Elena looked back at the house one last time. She saw the empty chair on the porch. She saw the single light burning in the kitchen. She saw the woman she had been and the woman she was now. She stepped off the porch, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't look back. She walked toward the car, toward the next mission, toward the next set of intervals. The pain in her shoulder was still there, a constant rhythmic companion. The numbness in her fingers was still there, a reminder of the cost she had paid. But as she reached the car, Elena Vance felt the silver watch against her thigh. Asterisk, tick, tick, tick. Asterisk, the time was exactly right. She opened the door and let the dog jump in first. Then she slid into the passenger seat and looked at the pilot. "Where are we going?" she asked. The pilot started the engine, the vibration of the car filling the small space. He looked at the road ahead, a dark, winding path that led down the mountain and into the unknown. "Wherever the friction is," he said. They drove away from the cabin, the headlights cutting a path through the humid Virginia night. Elena leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a component that had finally found its own system. The world was vast and broken and filled with 1,000 different frequencies. But as the car moved into the darkness, Elena Vance knew exactly what she was listening for. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the watch. She held it in her hand, feeling the steady, unwavering heartbeat of the gears. The signal was clear. She was exactly where she needed to be. The sun began to rise over the ridge, a pale American sun that touched the trees with a soft, golden light. It was a new day, a new frequency, and a new set of gears. And for the first time in a long time, Elena Vance wasn't waiting for the time to change. She was the one keeping it. The mountain fell away behind them, a silent witness to the woman who had walked into the fire and come out on the other side with her eyes wide open. She sat in the quiet of the car, her hand resting on the silver watch, watching the second hand sweep past the 12. The world was moving, and she was moving with it. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the specific, rhythmic music of a machine that was finally running true. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm carry her home. The dog sighed in her sleep, a warm, soft sound in the back of the van. Elena Vance smiled, a small, private thing that no one else would ever see. The watch ticked against her palm, a steady, unwavering promise in the dark. It was the only sound she needed to hear.